Hey everyone, welcome back to the Game Maker's Notebook. My name is Trent Kusters. I'm the co-founder and director at League of Geeks. And I'm excited to show you this interview that I've just had with Sam Barlow, game director of Half Mermaid. He's also the creator of Her Story and Telling Lies, and most recently their work, Immortality. I finished playing the game. It's an absolute, masterpiece for want of a better word. But it's an incredible piece of work and piece of fiction. It's hard to decide whether to call it a game, whether to call it a movie. It's both of those things at once, as you'll know from Sam's work. But as we do always here on the Game Maker's Notebook, we actually dive all the way back to the first time Sam started interfacing with games as a young kid in Britain. And we talk about his path all the way up to Her Story. So we talk about his time in text adventure community. We talk about his time at Climax Games, working on licenses like Serious Sam, Legacy of Kain, Silent Hill, and then, of course, his break into independent development and how he went about making Her Story, the motivations, the processes behind that. And then we leap forward to Immortality, his recent release, along with the crew at Half Mermaid. And we look at his work in this sort of FMV video game arena through the lens of Immortality. We talk a lot about process, how these games are made, the filming, the structure, even just the order, how the narrative is broken up and, passed on to players in the right order. It's an absolutely fascinating conversation. It's the longest one I've actually had here on Game Maker's Notebook. So if you're looking for a nice read, I think we clock it at like 2 hours or something like that. So please sit back, enjoy, or go for a long run, however you're going to enjoy this. And here it is, Sam Barlow of Half Mermaid.
It's a bit of a fairy tale. So Arthur Fisher, the great director, was casting for his new movie, Ambrosio. Mm-hmm. He saw 20,000 girls, and long story short, he picked you.
Yes.
What is your name?
Marissa Marcel.
Did we get it right?
It's not who we think he is. Cut. That's good. Ready to move on to the standing close-ups? Miss Perkins, you can flirt with Carl now.
Okay.
Well, welcome, Sam. It's great to have you here on Game Maker's Notebook.
Excited to be here.
As you should be. This used to be my jogging podcast, actually. So now that I'm on it, I'm really trying really hard to do it well because I don't get to listen to it when I jog anymore because it's just my own voice. I'm really glad when the guests come on. So I'm very, very excited to have you in here and have this conversation. But I will admit that I would have loved to have been able to listen to it while I jog as well and hear the story unfold, much like the stories in your games too. Now, let's just start this how we usually start everything, right? Which is, what's the first time you remember sort of interfacing with games and them capturing you as a child, and how did that set you on the path to making games?
So this is how I remember it, but there's a good chance this is like a false memory that's been inserted by my creator or whatever. But I'm pretty sure it was school. I feel like it was around the time two things happened. One was, so I went to this really small village school, and it was such a small school. There was a single girl in the whole school, and she was the head teacher's daughter. So it was like this real teeny school. And the head teacher was very eccentric. He was like this young guy, but he was obsessed with D.H. Lawrence. And he made and this was elementary school kids, primary school kids. he made us go on a school trip to D.H. Lawrence's birthplace once. And we're all like, we don't know who D.H. Lawrence is. But he would do stuff like, we'd come in the mornings and he'd be like, do you know what? Today, I think we should all just explore the woods. Like just go and play in the woods, right? You'd pay a lot of money for this kind of school now in Brooklyn. But at the time, this was just eccentric. And but part of his thing was he would say yes to any scheme or anything that, you know, if there was something that was the school district or whatever was doing and they were going to hand out stuff, he would sign up. So we were one of the first schools, I believe, to have a computer in the school. And this was, I don't think it was like a BBC Micro, something like that. It was like, you know, one of those educational computers. And also around that time, I think the school beat us to it, but around that time, my parents bought us an Amstrad CPC, which was, so kind of in the UK, the kind of 8-bit home computing, you had like the Spectrum, which was, you know, the punk. That was the cheap punk computer for all the cool kids. There was the Commodore, which was the expensive one for the rich kids that had really good sound. And, you know, it was clearly that was like the high-end model. And then there was the Amstrad CPC, which was, I don't think it was big. I know it was big in France and that was it, and like the UK. And it was made by like the British Trump, Alan Sugar. He was like, I'm going to make a computer. And so it was not sexy. It was not punk. It was not as good as the Commodore, although at the time I would, you know, argue till, you know, just
black and blue in the schoolyard.
Like, I think you'll find there are 24 colors in our high color CPC, which I think is, you know, all that nonsense. And so we had that, and you know, obviously that is like classic 8-bit home computer story in terms of like, oh, you had to type the games in, right? So you're forced back then to learn some basic and learn some coding just to type things in and play things, and so you know you have quite a more intimate and playful kind of relationship to the games. But I remember we had this computer in school, and this is very easy for me to now kind of narrativize and tie it all back. But I remember we had, maybe there were like 2 or 3 games on this thing, and one of them, which I tried tracking this down on the internet, and I don't think it exists anymore. But I found a couple of people who also remembered it. There was one of them, and I think it was like a kind of text adventure. And the premise was you were stranded on a desert island and you had to escape. And it was kind of cool because there were multiple ways to escape. You know, it was kind of somewhat nonlinear and exploratory and open world. But the way it worked was because we had this one computer and a school full of kids, you would get like your slot on the computer once a week or once every 2 weeks. So you'd play this game, and then I would spend the 2 weeks in between playing it in my head, like coming up with solutions. Like, oh my god, well I had some, you know, can I start a fire on the beach? I had some matches or something, like, oh, and then there's a snake, well, you know, and so then I would come back and sit down, and then you get to try and like all the things you've been imagining whilst you're away in your head, playing the game in your head, you then had to come and test out, and obviously they usually didn't work.
I imagine the game is much larger in your head after 2 weeks of fantasizing about it as well, and building all these theories.
Yeah, and I imagine it's one of those things that if a copy did exist somewhere on the internet and I loaded it up now, I'd be like, huh. Like, I went down a rabbit hole, and I think like the guy who wrote this game was in some ways prominent in like educational theory. Like he was kind of semi on the cutting edge of like, oh, this is how computers can help education and stuff. There's like a couple of his games, but I think they genuinely want, you know, something that was kind of lost to time. So I remember that. And obviously, you know, that was very exciting and interesting to me. And then, we just had our home computer at home, and, you know, it's easy to have kind of roasted in spectacles and look back and be like, well, it was very exciting back then because the industry didn't exist in the same way. Genres had not stratified in the same way. So there was just genuinely out there stuff, right? There was, you know, I show my kids, I'm like, look, there's this game called Frankie Goes to Hollywood that was inspired by this band. And in it, you were hallucinating in a VR world and you had to walk around, take drugs, solve murders. And it was like, you know, because no one knew. No one was like, this is how games should work. And all the control schemes were terrible. And, you know.
We were just figuring shit out, weren't we? We were just throwing stuff out in the dark.
I was like, there's a game called Deus Ex, not the one that you've heard of. There was a game called Deus Ex that came with a cassette, and the game would play out in like, I don't know, an hour of real time. And you'd have to press play on the cassette when you started the game. And it played music by some kind of prominent like prog rock musicians, had spoken word poetry that played alongside it. And in the game you started as a sperm and you went through all the stages of life, eventually becoming an old man and dying.
Oh, this is a spore? Is this?
Yeah, it was probably, I don't know. It's always probably a much worse game, and in some ways, much better games, I don't know. But yeah, that was my in very much.
That was a little kernel, right? Like the little in, and it sounded super affecting. So then, what's the leap from that to actually, enthusiast? Were you a hobbyist or an enthusiast? Were you tinkering before you started doing it professionally or commercially?
Yeah, and I think like my background is that both my parents. My dad was, I think, the first person to go to university in his family.
Right.
Both my parents came from essentially kind of working class backgrounds.
Yeah, and this is Britain.
In the UK, and so to them, like the idea of a career at that point was, you go to school, you do the classic subjects, and then you could get my dad was a civil engineer, so then you could get a job in a profession, and this is the onboarding ramp to the middle class, right? This is how it goes. So I really didn't have any conception, and it's kind of silly that any of the kind of creative professions were a thing that I could do. It wasn't like I was an obsessive reader. Once I kind of hit my teens, I got massively into movies. I used to paint. And there were all these kind of creative outlets, but it never was the thing where I was like, oh, maybe this is something I could do for my job when I grow up. So I ended up, going to university, and I think I started off doing physics and shifted after the first year to math because I was like, I'm literally spending all day in a room with a bunch of guys and an oscilloscope. Like this is like I'd sold myself on physics because I'd read like Brief History of Time and stuff, and I was like, oh, this is like the answer to the universal questions. This is going to be so exciting. Yeah, and then you get there and it's like just measuring things and doing stuff. And it was only really so. I mean, and the crazy thing was, as you say, I was doing all the hobbyist stuff. So I remember, like, probably the least cool thing in my life is for my, maybe it's like 14th, 15th birthday, my present that I asked for and got was the Maxam assembler for the Amstrad CPC, which allowed you to program assembly language, which, was required if you wanted to make a proper video game. Right. So I was like tinkering with that stuff. I've never necessarily been like a hardcore programmer, but obviously to do anything, you had to do some programming. Yeah.
But so tinkering enough to be asking for it for Christmas, right? Like it's
yeah. Well, I mean, those magazines were such a critical thing. Yeah. Where, if you were into computer games, the internet didn't exist. So we would get Amstrad Action was the name of the magazine, and it would have the type-ins, it would have the game reviews, it would have all this stuff. And so and you would read page to page, like every page cover to cover. Yeah. So you were aware of these things. So I was aware that the Maxam assembly compiler was the best of these software packages, right? Yeah. So I remember, so I was doing stuff, and me and my friends would, again, I can very easily tie this all back in, but we would write games for each other, and we'd do a lot of like text adventure kind of games as well as kind of simple arcade games. And the text adventure games, we would usually write about each other. So I would write a game about my friend Alex trying to get laid, right? And the puzzles was in it, and there was a level of tension between the game and the player because it was
about
intended for Alex to play. And so, just when you think that Alex is going to succeed or whatever, the game punishes them and lambasts them for being such a terrible human being. So there was, we were making these.
So there was a documentarian element to it as well. It was almost like non-fiction too, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, they were quite heavily fictional, but there was definitely like this antagonism between like the role of the player. It wasn't just like here's sort of fun adventure you're going on. So I was doing all that kind of stuff. And then when I was at university, the university kind of computer lab was where I got my first real like access to the internet as it was then.
Mm-hmm.
And, so the first thing you do is like, well, I want to download some games. But then it's like, oh, it's going to take 48 hours to
come back on Friday to play this game. Yeah.
So then you're like, well, what games can I download? And then you find like, oh, there's this archive of text games. And then you discovered that like there's a scene for modern text games. People are making new text adventures, and kind of discovered this incredible scene that kind of in the late 90s congregated around like the rec arts int fiction news groups. And there was a couple of people. There's like this guy Graham Nelson who created, I think it started as like a kind of archival historical thing, but he kind of deconstructed and then rebuilt from the ground up the system that Infocom used to make all of their classic text games, like Zork and all these games. And he then ended up using that to create a set of tools and then release those for free. So you could get these tools and suddenly you had the ability to make a text game with all of the bells and whistles of these kind of classic Infocom ones. But
it's like an early game engine type thing.
Yeah, it was very much, back when proper game engines cost millions of dollars. But the really cool thing was this scene, and this is where I got excited. A lot of it was fueled by nostalgia for people that had grown up on these classic text games, or even people that had kind of discovered them anew. But a lot of it was people going, well, actually, how do we go one better? And there was a lot of people there who were really interested in kind of pushing the envelope in interactive narrative. And it was like a very competitive group because most of the people there, we were playing each other's games, but we were also making our own games. There was this annual competition where, everyone was competing to do the coolest stuff. And, that was something that I kind of got heavily immersed in. So, if you were looking from the sidelines, you'd be like, oh, here's Sam. He's super interested in interactive narrative. He's making all these games. It would make sense for Sam to go look for a job in the games industry working on narrative games. But at the time, it was like, well, this is a hobby. And as well, I think all of the text people, knowing that entire industry had gone away, like no one was making text games anymore.
Yeah, right.
The best
this is sort of
creators of text games, even like point-and-click adventure games had died, right? So everyone that was making these things was very upfront, like, we will never make money from this. Like, this is... And
you're saying this is like, your sort of first access to the internet. Are we still localized? Is this a worldwide community that you're now a part of? Or was it still a UK centric group of creators?
No, this was global. I mean, obviously it's predominantly English speaking because those were the games we were playing. And, but yeah, it was a collection of people. So it was, there's a lot of people at American universities. It was pretty much people at university or college.
Yeah, right.
It was people that have the time to sit in a computer lab for a couple of hours, access this FTP, download stuff. A lot of it, like Graham Nelson, I think was at the University of Oxford. So that was where he had the time and the wherewithal to create these systems. So it was a lot of academics and undergraduates uploading and downloading from each other's FTPs.
And were you in college at this time?
I was at the University of Bristol, and at this point, I was either doing physics or math.
Yeah. And are you interacting with this community as well? Or are you sort of just like lurking and watching and maybe submitting a game every now and then? Or are you quite an active participant?
Probably more of an active participant than a maker of games at this point. So, there's a lot of like kind of academic debate back and forth about like how, theoretically how one might go about telling an interactive story, as well as critiquing and reviewing other people's things. And like I say, there was, a big part of the tradition was once a year, this competition would happen. And part of the competition was to then play and review and critique each other's games, right? So there were certain people who became prominent mostly as critics rather than actually
right, okay.
stuff.
All right, so you're part of this community. You're in college, and it's sort of this hobbyist thing, as you're mentioning. Like even some of these folks, it's not even really a commercial endeavor because that wave of text adventure games, the commercial wave, has passed. So then, what's the next step? Where does this? Where does it go from here?
Then it becomes very random. So I finish university. I end up getting like a good degree in maths, but I do not want to go and do graduate study in mathematics. And I look at the list of jobs you can get with mathematics, and I'm like, oh crap. These are all perfectly valid jobs. Like there's nothing wrong with being an actuary, but not necessarily for me. And I was exhibiting paintings whilst I was doing this. I was writing probably, in retrospect, terrible fiction. So like 90% of what I was doing was on the more creative kind of art and kind of creative writing side. But my day job was doing math. And as we were getting towards the end of college and everyone else is getting jobs, there were like a lot of these career fairs. And the hack was a lot of the banks and people like that would have like a careers evening or something, and they would give you free alcohol and food. So, and I was like, me and the people that I was sharing a place with would basically have a full schedule of these things that you would go to, because you would basically turn up, have some food, get drunk, and then you'd go out for the evening afterwards. And at one of those, I met a US tech company called MicroStrategy, which at the time was pioneering a big data approach to things. I think they were like the first company that allowed you to kind of query a gigabyte, maybe it was a gigabyte back then, database. So like all the big stores and everything were all like, oh, maybe we could do something with all this customer data. At the time, that was very exciting and fun. And the guy that ran it, he's done like the full tech bro kind of
character arc,
very kind of proto Elon Musk, in that he was this nerdy guy who had now suddenly become one of the wealthiest men in the world, and was like dating, I don't know, at some point I think he was supposedly dating the Sultan of Brunei's widow. It's like hanging out with Puff Daddy because they were so rich.
As you do.
But like awkwardly was living out, his missed teenage years, and buying lots of leather outfits and like all this kind of stuff. But this company was there, and they were like, hey, if you have a good degree in math, you can come work for us in America, and we'll give you lots of money. And it's like, we're the future. We're going to be. And I was like, I don't really know what else to do. Seems cool that they're going to pay me lots of money. It sounds exciting to move to the United States of America. And it's like having this bizarre, eccentric billionaire as a boss. He was like building a replica French chateau somewhere in the Virginia countryside. Just had all these kind of silly billionaire things he was doing. So I was like, this just seems like a fun option, right? I'll at least do this. I've got nothing else to do. So I did that, and very quickly, that didn't turn out so great. There was a point where the SEC had some issues with how the company had been doing its accounting, and then like the full-scale .com collapse happened. And although
you're in the States now, you moved to the States for this gig. Yeah,
I'm in DC.
Whereabouts? Yeah, DC. Okay.
Yeah. We lived just a bit outside DC, which and that was like a huge disappointment to me, because I'd never been to the States. I knew that Washington DC was the capital, so I was imagining it would be a really fun place like London or Paris, right? Like that's the capital city. And then I get there and I'm like, oh no, crap, that's
the
New
other
York.
Washington.
DC is actually, it's we had some fun there, but
it's not what you expect as a kid growing up in Britain.
Yeah, it's not the kind of cultural melting pot kind of vibe. So at some point, and I took a second job to keep my visa, and that was even more tortured. I will say that like it's very easy to make a narrative out of this and be like, oh, Sam went and worked at this company that was doing databases, and like
now you search databases in his game. Oh my
few weeks, like they had this boot camp they were very proud of, where everyone that's joined the company, whatever position they were in, had to muck in and do this 6 weeks of intense learning. And one of the culmination of this was they gave you a data set from, I don't know, let's say Walmart. Like, here is a dump of Walmart data. and we would have to do stuff with it. And I remember it was genuinely quite interesting when they start explaining like, oh, you would like slice the data and be like, oh, they had all the cliches of like, how they noticed that people that bought nappies also bought beer.
Right. Okay.
And so in a lot of the American stores, they realized one day you have like a choice. If you've got you've got the new dad that's been sent out to buy nappies or diapers, and one thing you could do is you can put the diapers on an aisle that's very close to the beer aisle. So then the dad's like, oh, whilst I'm here,
I'll grab some beer. Yeah.
Or you could put them really far apart and force them to buy everything else in between, whatever. But it was kind of interesting to dig into these data sets and be like, wow. And like I was like a huge fan of like the surrealists and a lot of kind of avant-garde literature. So the idea of like found narrative, right? Of like, oh, here's going to the gallery, right? There's just a bunch of objects on the floor. It's telling a story. Like to be just dumped into all of this data that if you looked at it in the right way did actually tell you kind of interesting human stories. Clearly that somehow lodged in my head.
Did something, planted something. Yeah.
Well, basically that all went reasonably horribly wrong. I ended up coming back to the UK and was then in this really awkward position where I was no longer a beautiful, pristine graduate, but I didn't have enough real world experience that I was in any way an experienced hire. Plus, the as far as the world was concerned, they looked at what I'd done and they were like, "Oh, this is like a .com guy," and this was a point where the entire .com thing was imploding. And I had this run of like taking job interviews in London, and in the interview, I'd be like, "Hey, you're still going to be here in a month, right?" And they'd be like, "Yeah, of course." And I'd be like, "Because they said that in the last place," and they would kind of laugh, "Ha ha 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 ha." And then 2 weeks later, their email stopped.
Gone.
Oh, they're gone.
And so you're looking to go back to the UK at this point as well. You're
At this point, like and I was with my now wife was back in the UK, and at some point it made sense. Oh, maybe she would join me. And at this point, it was like I'm having to struggle and work at these companies and fight for my visa. It'd be easier just to go back. But I find myself back there, and it's a struggle to figure out, who will hire me. And I have a friend who, actually the same friend I was writing those text adventures for, Alex, he at that point was a programmer at a game studio in the UK. And he's like, well, you're an artist, right? You do all this art. Why don't you get a job as a video games artist? I was like, okay. And so I had...
So you're still painting in the back? You're still painting on the side and doing like artistic endeavors?
Doing all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, okay.
And I think I had my justification when I was in the kind of tech job was at that time, like people were genuinely becoming stupidly wealthy, very young. And part of the justification in my head was like, look, I'll do this and cash out, and then I can go off and do fun, creative things.
Yeah.
I was like, it's still in my head, kind of seeing it, not as a hobby, but like not as part of the day-to-day.
Yeah.
So I then, in my head, I'm remembering this as a weekend, but maybe it was longer. But I basically had a weekend where I downloaded a cracked version of Maya. Sorry, Autodesk. Maya. And all the packages, right? And created a video games portfolio, which to my relief no longer exists on the internet. I think like this was something I uploaded just early enough that it wasn't like, if you did it now, it's going to get captured. Right?
There are a few of us who are around early enough where it's like our traumatic past and transgressions were early enough to have been forgotten. We've been blessed with that for sure.
I mean, God, this portfolio I put together, I remember there was, to show my concept art abilities, I'd come up with the idea of like a JRPG that revolved around a world in which rope was sentient or symbiotic with humans. And so as you leveled up, your rope got longer. And so there were all these enemies that were based on rope somehow.
Good.
And I illustrated all these interesting characters. And then
it's got legs,
I had
man. It's got legs.
I'd made like a spaceship with some weird aliens in it that was in 3D. That was in Web 3D, so you could actually just load it in the browser. was kind
Go
of cool.
through.
I'd made all the characters from Rupert the Bear. I don't know if you have Rupert the Bear.
Rupert the Bear.
Rupert
No,
the
we
Bear
have a lot of UK television, but I'm Googling it now. Rupert
I think
the
there was a TV show. Rupert the Bear was a comic strip that I think was carried in like one of the main newspapers.
Oh, yeah, I know
And
Rupert.
my present every year from one of my aunties was like the Rupert the Bear annual. I think it's probably now, in retrospect, slightly racist. I imagine it's, I don't know if they've rebooted it or
redacted it. Rupert's a little problematic.
I remember I built like 3D character models and rigged them of all the Rupert the Bear characters. So I did like a bunch of all this stuff.
Great.
Sent that. I remember I bought like Edge magazine and something else to try and figure out all the different companies in the UK. And I'm pretty sure, I think the joke is I sent my portfolio in like a kind of open thing, job ask to every games company in the UK. And only one of them responded.
Feeling the love, Sam. Feeling the love.
And that was Climax. That was Climax Studios.
Oh, shit, really? Wow.
Were about to embark on making a serious Sam game for console. And one of the things that was in my portfolio was I had done a Quake level, like a Radiant. That was, massive cliche. It was like a Lovecraftian shipping, like port or something. It was like a lighthouse.
Right, okay. Yep.
Some beasties or something. And so they had seen that I could use Radiant, and they were having to use like the Serious Sam editor, the Crow Team editor, which was similar. So they were just looking for people that had that background. I think a lot of the rest of the team.
What year are we talking now, Sam?
This would have been early 2000s.
Yeah. Yep.
So this was being made for the GameCube, but at that point the GameCube didn't completely exist. It was still like the Dolphin.
Okay. Yep.
It was like a big mess of wires and stuff. So they pulled me in for an interview based on the fact that I had purely like there was nothing like, oh, this is some beautiful art or anything. It was like, oh, this guy can actually use a 11
yeah, that's it. Yeah, less training for this one.
And I guess I impressed them, and so they gave me a job. So I was technically hired as an artist using the level editor, but very quickly I was basically doing level design. And in those editors, like there really wasn't a difference. Like it was very awkward because the level designer was essentially making all the choices about where the polygons go and where the verts go, because you're slicing these BSP brushes and stuff. So the artists, they kind of had the job of just coming in and texturing stuff and occasionally placing props and stuff. So it was quite awkward. There's a bit of tension there, I think. But, so I was brought in, technically hired by the artist on the art team, making these levels. And then just very rapidly at that point, made it clear that I had lots of opinions about game design, and spoke too much in all the meetings. And so,
which was how you became a game designer back in those days as well.
So
right?
they officially moved me onto the design team, hoping that would shut me up, and it didn't. So then the next game, they made me a lead designer, hoping that would shut me up, and then kind of the rest is history. But yeah, so very quick. I mean, I don't think this career path exists anymore. Like I was literally
no, it doesn't. It was my career path as well. It's like you get a shot as something in a game studio, and then like I came on as a writer designer, like junior writer designer. Within like as soon as they sat me down, I was like heading up one of the games, and then within like by the time I finished my probation, I was just like the lead designer on like 3 different games. And that's just how it was just the rest is like, yeah, you just keep bringing you games. I mean, you just pump them out, you know?
And like with narrative back then as well, it was like, oh, this person likes stories.
Yeah.
They're gonna, I remember someone had the idea. So I don't think we were I don't think we were credited, but there wasn't much writing in Serious Sam, but you did need one-liners and stuff. And someone had the idea that
little barks and things.
They should just get everyone after work to go to someone's house and give everyone free alcohol. That would create jokes. As if like that's how jokes get written, right? In the real world, because the drunker you are, the funnier you are, right? That's obviously the worst way to come up with funny. Because then the next day you look through the list, and you're like, oh, here's all the funny jokes we wrote. Huh. I guess they were funny at the time.
Yeah. Oh, I'll
But
put
yeah,
them in the
so
game.
I was-
We've got a ship.
So I think the funny thing is if people look at my career on Wikipedia or look into the interactive fiction stuff, like when I was at college in 1999, I made this text game called Isle, which became something of a kind of cult hit, if you can call it that.
Is this just one of those games that you made when you were in that little community?
Yeah, and this was
right.
This was me trying to be clever, and it was this game that took place in a supermarket aisle, and it had 132 different endings. It was this very fractured narrative, and it had this gimmick that the game lasted a single turn. So you would type something, and then the story would complete, and then you'd start again. So it was you can see some connective tissue. So people see that I made that, and they're like, oh, clearly Sam was like the interactive narrative guy. And then he did a Silent Hill game, and then he did Her Story and stuff. But the reality is, when I started in the industry, I got there because my friends said, hey, you could get a job as a games artist. And then I got there, and then I'm making Serious Sam. And to be fair to me, like as soon as I was there, like whatever the game I was working on, it was the most important game in the world to me. So when I was working on Serious Sam, a lot of the arguments were like, I think the lead designer on that game was like a big Counter-Strike fan. And so everything from him was like flow, level flow and everything.
Yeah.
And I was coming at it from in terms of first-person shooters, I was like, well, I really liked GoldenEye. And I like the fact they had all these pointless, redundant rooms, but because they were my architects. But also like my insight was to then go, but let's look at Serious Sam, because the previous games existed and we were doing like the first console version. This isn't really a first-person shooter. This is more like Contra. Like that's the game. It's an arcade shooter. It's very much designed, and obviously like their inspiration was like Doom. But for me, I was like, look at the way like a good Serious Sam level is less about the flow, and it's more about what arrangement of enemies get dropped in what order with what weapons you have.
Yeah,
and so I was, even though I was getting very deep into what makes Serious Sam fun, how does the enemy balance and weapon design work, and I think I was the one that like I was like, we should put like a combo system in this game, because we should be rewarding you for doing the things that is fun in this game, and we should
for
be
that dance.
If you can run through a whole level and kill everyone in a single combo chain, right? Like that, that creates kind of interesting gameplay. So, I was going deep on that, and then even in the next game we got to work on there's just so much randomness and silliness back then.
Was it like Krusty Demons, or was it like Ghost Rider?
It's Krusty Demons. And the studio, so Climax Studios has at one point, I think at that point maybe it was the biggest independent game developer in Europe, but mostly doing work for hire. They kept trying to have their kind of own IP hit and stuff. It never quite worked. But one of the studios that they had acquired made basically the best bike games. They were in Brighton, and they were making MotoGP. It was like they made literally the best bike games in the world. And so when they were looking for work, like this company had bought the rights to a group of motocross guys. We could do this whole podcast about Krusty Demons, but basically,
I grew up in like southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. Like Krusty Demons were like idols to a bunch of the most ragtag guys like in our area.
I think you're maybe the first person I've ever spoken to.
There was a big part. I spent my youth like avoiding the Krusty Demons like jocks, and then the Australian rules football jocks. That was like there was a narrow path dodging that like Serious Sam combo style out of my area.
Well, I had to embrace it. I had to lean into it. But so someone bought the rights to Krusty Demons, thinking it would be like the next Jackass. They were like, I think they had literally also bought the rights to Jackass. They were like, hey, Tony Hawk's Extreme Sports is cool. In America, people like motorsports. This will be a huge hit. And then they were like, well, who's going to make this game for us? And so they're like, oh, Climax experts at bikes. We'll get them to do it. But then Climax is like, well, the bike studio is busy. So we'll get this studio, which is just, I think some of the higher ups at the studio liked motorbikes. But, we were not We were not the bike studio, but they were like, so you're going to work on Krusty Demons. And I was made lead designer on it. So for me, that was like super exciting because I was lead designer.
Of course, yeah.
And
how old are you at this point in time? Like mid-20s, early 20s?
Yeah, it's early 20s.
Yeah.
Too young to know any better.
Yeah,
and
too young for every game to be the most important game, right? So,
yeah. And so we're making Krusty Demons, and it was just, that was like, I mean, of all the games, so many games get cancelled. The fact that game made it to the shelves is incredible, because it kept, I mean, the companies went bankrupt a couple of times and then would sell the rights to a new company they created.
Of course.
It almost got cancelled a couple of times. There was a very memorable Christmas where we went on vacation for Christmas, being told on the 24th of December, on Christmas Eve, we will call you to let you know if you still have a job.
Wow.
The games industry, man.
Yeah, I remember as well, though, like those early studios too, it was kind of just like, you know, because we worked in a very similar studio. It sounds like I was in probably the most prolific independent studio in Australia, like Taurus Games. And it was just the amount of freedom that you had from those publishers to just, like, I remember when we did a Scooby-Doo game, Warner Brothers just said, we want Lego Star Wars with Mystery Inc. And then the rest was just like, go, you know, and we want by this date, and this is the money that you have.
Usually that's the thing, the time, there's so little time.
So little time.
And everyone's stressed because usually the game exists only because there's an IP or there's a movie.
Yeah, exactly.
So they just need it out, right? And I mean, Krusty Demons was incredible because they bought this IP, and then unlike you, it turned out that a lot of the world had not heard of the Krusty Demons.
Yeah, right.
And so I really beautiful memories of, and we kind of went back and forth a lot of times on what should this game be. And like they had ideas. So they were like, it should be about dating girls. Like you impress girls with it. And I think like BMX Triplex was about to come out. So they're like, do we make it really racy? And then they were like, oh no, we pulled back from that. It has to be like hardcore stunts. And we did this tour of America where we did focus tests all around America, which was just incredible because they were during the day on school days and mainly teenage boys. So the teenage boys who were not in school when they should be showing up for these things was like you. I mean, I think you have an idea of the Krusty Demons types.
Yes, I do.
This is a very particular type of young man, and so we would be sat behind the one-way mirror, and they would read. Here is a description of a game that we are working on. Tell us what you think, and they would read the kind of high-level pitch of the game, and it just went from bad to worse. Like these kids thought the name was hilarious. They were like, who the F are the Krusty Demons? What is, like, we don't know anything about this. We don't care about this. The one point a kid got up to the glass, like in a police show, banged on the glass, was like, your game sucks. Who the F are the Krusty Demons? And I remember turning, and the guy from the publisher was there with me. And he was the guy, I think, who had signed the IP.
Yeah. So he was committed.
Blood was draining from his face. He was just going more and more into himself as we progressed. So it got to a point, we'd done 2 or 3 of these things. We'd done like Philadelphia and Chicago. And I was like, should we mix? I was like, clearly this isn't working. Like, should we mix it up? And the one thing that had played well was when they showed these kids the videos. Yeah. They did enjoy the crashing and the silliness.
Yeah, of course.
Which is a big part of those videos. So I wrote a 1-pager quickly that was basically like, let's give these kids what they want. And it was like, so this is going to be the dumbest, most violent, silliest bike game. You get to ride around on little mini machines, chase after women, smash into things, cause havoc. And the kids were like, yeah, this sounds like a cool game. I like it. Yeah. So then the exec was like, whew, okay, that's the game. So then we proceeded to try and make this game, and it came out to sort of like minimal fanfare, though. Even though you led right in. So famously, I think Games TM magazine in the UK said every single individual involved in the making of this game should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves. 2 out of 10,
and you were right.
Well, I mean. Not to make this whole podcast
we'll move on in a second, but
we had this genius coder who in their spare time had written an incredible piece of ragdoll tech. And this was like around the time Ragdoll was an idea, but was like, there were cool demos and stuff, but it wasn't something that a lot of games pulled off. And so this kid had created this ragdoll system where he could have multiple ragdolls happening on an Xbox or whatever, and it looked really good. And so we immediately stuck it on the rider and then discovered it was insanely fun to crash this bike and make horrible things happen to this ragdoll. And so then I was like, that's the gameplay. I was like, this is the fun. There was one guy on our team who was really into stunts and Tony Hawks and stuff. Yeah. He was the one that was constantly like, no, this should be about hardcore. And I was like, no. We added a button. You had a button to bail from your bike. So you would basically then drive as fast as you could, steer the bike, and then bail from the bike to launch your rider and we put targets up on walls that you had to smash. And then there were like whole missions that were like, it was horrific. It was like,
I remember we did
kind of endemic sexism and stuff. Like there were missions in Amsterdam where you had to smash through windows into brothels and knock people over. It was just, I mean, the one accolade we got was IGN Xbox gave us Game of the Month.
It's like employee of the month.
And this was when we launched, when it eventually came out, because there was all sorts of trouble. I think the 360 was now out. So being Xbox Game of the Month was not actually as good an accolade as it sounds like, because at this point, most people have moved on.
You're the previous champ.
They celebrated, there was a mission in New York where you had to run over pimps in a little mini convertible. And every time you did it, it went into slow motion and pimp hit came up on the screen. And
they were like sold.
This was the funniest thing. Just a lot of gifs of pimp hits.
Pimp hit.
So that was the moment in the south for Cross Demons. It was, to tie it into the larger narrative, the first, I don't know if I was credited, it was my first full-on writing gig.
Okay, right.
Please,
there you go. Pimp hit. Your first.
I think there are videos online, so don't judge me, people. But writing like the and we were. I mean, in my defense, I think we were attempting to if not satirize, just like go so hard on that. Teenage boys will find this humor funny. It's all crime and gangsters and sex. Like
it sounds like you were exercising something from your own youth as well.
I don't know. I guess it would be maybe where Saints Row is now, like that. That vibe of like, we know this is dumb, but we're just going to go.
We're just going to do
it. Maybe it's still dumb. I don't know.
All right.
But it did give me a chance to get in a recording studio and work with actors and write stuff and be like, oh, this is how this works.
So Crusty Demons, you went on. There are other games, obviously, that you did at Climax, like Ghost Rider and stuff. But I think it would be amiss of us, before we get into the sort of the independent Sam Barlow era with her story and stuff and taking that leap, just to touch base on Silent Hill, because you did Origins and Shattered Memories also at Climax. And was this, I mean, was the title game director around at that time? Were you directing these, or was it more design and writing? Run us through a little bit, because this was also big, I imagine, big gigs for Climax too, even.
Yeah, I mean, that whole game director thing at that time, the game after that, which never came out, the Legacy of Kain game, I was credited as game director. Because at that point, it was like, this is what we should be calling this role. Prior to that, game director had been a role we used, but it usually meant producer.
Right.
Producer was the boss. But yeah, I mean, Silent Hill, again, we could do a whole podcast, but the short of it is Climax opened up an LA office that was their attempt to sign more work, because the LA scene, the US scene was big, and the fact that we were in a weird part of the UK sometimes made it difficult for people to conceive of us as people that they should be giving work to. So they created this LA office and they hired a lot of LA developers, and somehow they got the gig to make a Silent Hill game, mostly because they became chummy with or met in a professional capacity, Konami of America. And this is where it gets kind of tortured, because obviously Silent Hill was created by Konami in Japan. And at this point in time, they had decided to stop making Silent Hill games because they were not making money, right? They decided that after 3, started making an original horror game, and then at some point panicked and called that Silent Hill 4 and made it part of Silent Hill. But at that point, they kind of stopped. They were like, this is not working. You could probably look at that and then point to the eventual decline in original single-player games by Konami. But then a movie was going to happen, right? If you remember, there was the Silent Hill movie.
I remember it, yeah.
Big exciting news, right? So then Konami of America, who up till that point hadn't necessarily developed a lot of games themselves. I think were mostly in distribution. Were starting to try and do development work themselves, and so I think they were like, oh, we 100% should have a Silent Hill game to go with the movie, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't have time or money to do that. And so they had ended up putting out, this is very much dates this period of time, but the PSP had just come out, and the PSP had its own unique little UMD discs.
Yeah, I remember it, yeah.
So they put out a Silent Hill UMD, which was basically a collection of making of movies, some kind of digitized comics.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like, what stuff do we have that we can put on a disc and call it a package and sell it when the movie comes out? But off of that, they then almost essentially had created accidentally like a Silent Hill team within Konami of America. And they had decided at some point to, I think they initially tried to remake Silent Hill 1, realized that was too expensive. So then had decided to make a prequel. At this point, I would point out, in my opinion, this is a very silly idea, because Silent Hill 1 is a story told almost entirely in flashback, and there is nothing to explain. Yeah. So they're like, we're going to go back 7 years and see what happened. And it's like, we know. We saw it.
That's the first game. We've done it. Yeah.
And they started making this game with the team in LA, and they got, I don't know how long, they spent an amount of time working on it, and there were huge issues. They were using an in-house engine that I think was not necessarily working. So it started to become problematic that they had nothing to show for the game. So we as a team, who at this point had our own in-house engine that we were working on, we hadn't yet shipped Ghost Rider, but it was like, it was a pretty good looking character action engine.
Yeah.
So we did a thing where for a week we took the team off that project. I don't know if I can. Technically, that's a bad thing to say that legally.
It's really statute of limitations. It's fine. Yeah.
On their break, put out it was literally. I mean, that team was incredible. Like that, it was an incredible team that worked really hard. Some fantastic people. So within a week, and we were all like Silent Hill fans, so we were like, "Oh, this is cool."
Let's go.
We basically made a demo in a week of like, this is our engine doing some Silent Hill stuff.
Yeah.
Sent that back. That saved the day. LA continued, and we're going to use our engine to make it. But
amazing.
More time passes, the game still is not where it needs to be. And in fact, we have a look at the game, and to me, and especially Neil Williams, who is my lead artist, we were both huge Silent Hill fans.
Yeah.
What we saw shocked us to the core. We were like, this is not a Silent Hill game. This is the lore is all messed up. Like, this is 7 years earlier, but characters look older. Like, the tone of the horror is wrong. It's, to us, it was a very big misfire. Yeah.
And you didn't go and have opinions again, did you, Sam?
Yes, we did. We kept saying to the bosses, like, what the hell? Like, how are you letting them do this? And we kept saying it. And at some point, maybe Konami realized as well, and Konami started getting nervous. And so then the bosses came to us and they said, look, Konami's nervous about this game. Do you think you could fix it? And we were like, sure. And they were like, but you don't get any more time or money. So it's only what money's left to fix this game.
Yeah.
We said yes. It officially moved to our studio. And day one, me and Neil looked at it and we went, right, we have to throw out the script, throw out the story, throw out the monsters, throw out the level designs. Like, we'll use what we can, but it's a ground floor rewrite in a lot of these areas. And the bosses were like, well, you only have 6 months to ship the game or something. And so then
you're giving me PTSD. This is very
we proceeded
familiar.
to then just work very hard. I literally didn't sleep. I would go home. So I rewrote the script in like a week. And so this is not a good script, right? But it was like, what can we do to just make this work?
And then to bring it back into
the bosses were like, well, we don't have time to storyboard this, so I'm not sure this is going to work, because it takes the animators this long to storyboard. So I was like, okay. So I went home. I storyboarded the whole thing. I was like, we need new monsters. You can't. We don't have the money. I would go home. I did the concept art for a lot of the monsters, design the monsters. So like, just became like a brute force. Like, we're going to make this work.
Sheer will. Yeah.
And there were things we couldn't change. The main character made no sense to me. It was ridiculous. They had, in their version, there was an origin story to Pyramid Head, which made no sense. Yeah. We got to tweak that, but we're told the character who's essentially Pyramid Head has to be in it. He's been in the marketing. They'd done a post teaser thing. They had made a CGI intro and a CGI outro. They'd spent 2/3 of the money on those. We were not throwing that money away. So we then had to like edit and tweak what was there to fit what we're doing. But we managed to. The fun thing as a designer was they were attempting crazily to rip off Resident Evil 4.
Yeah,
which was to create a more action orientated thing, and didn't make sense. But we went, look, we only have 6 months, so this has to be classic Silent Hill. Like we haven't got the time to figure this stuff out. But it was a real joy at points to be working in such a tightly
constraint is an amazing thing.
Because then you're like, I know exactly how a classic Silent Hill level works.
Yeah,
let's do a good one, right? Like, and we know how these cameras work. We know all these things work. So,
you had this one where it was like absolute constraint. You just got to get a Silent Hill game out the door in less than 6 months. Rally to make that happen. Then the next one, obviously, you've done a decent job because Shattered Memories comes out, and for me, looking at Shattered Memories, it's where I see the first sort of hints of, Sam Barlow's interaction design sort of coming through and shining through, even things like the way that you interface with particular things, or, the classic, the tests that you have with your psychologist and things like that. So tell me a little bit about how that came about and the difference in regards to like being able to set that up, and how much control or influence you and your team had over that game, and even just down to the little interactions that you have with it, because it kind of was a little bit, I mean, Silent Hill had that, especially in ones like For the Room and stuff. Like there were levels of interaction that were a bit deeper than the earlier ones. But how did that come about?
So yeah, this was definitely like the making of me in that, again, like if you'd looked at me making Isle in 1999, you'd have said, well, this is exactly the kind of game Sam wants to make. But like I say, once it was my day job, I was making the best serious Sam game I could make. I was making the best Cryptic Demons game. When we made the Ghost Rider game, I read every single issue of Ghost Rider to get into that world.
Of course,
I shouldn't have done. But so getting to make Silent Hill Origins was this weird double-edged sword, because it was like, oh my God, this is like in my top 3 franchises. This is the kind of storytelling, the kind of genre that I'm into. But at the same time, we are kind of forced to make a mediocre version of it.
Yeah.
And so then after that, like Konami knew how much work we had done to ship that game. I still say to this day that like probably the team and the effort I'm most proud of would be that game, just in terms of like what we achieved. The world looks at that game and sees a 6 or 7 out of 10, but knowing what we did, like
what went on behind the scenes.
So straight away there were discussions of like doing something more. At points it was like doing another PSP game, because Sony was still like really pushing people to do cool stuff on PSP. I knew we had like this. You're saying that freedom that sometimes existed in that world. We had an incredible amount of freedom because our producer was something of a maverick. He had kind of
in the late 2000s of game
I
development. Really?
I want to speak too ill of him him being the Silent Hill producer almost happened by accident, because he was around, did this UMD thing, and suddenly he's now heading it up. And we had taken him out drinking once, and he had confided in me that like his vision for Silent Hill was he wanted to make it go mainstream, and he wanted to create a first-person shooter. And to him, he was pitching this to me as Brahms PD. He was like, you're a cop, you got a gun, it's a first-person shooter, like it'd be much bigger and like we could, much more commercial. So we were pitching them at various points, like different ideas. And I thought I was being very clever. I had ideas that I wanted to see realized. And so this was really me being like that part of me that's been interested in interactive narratives and all these kind of creative expressions. This is a chance for me to do some fun stuff. And so I tried to be too clever and be like, I'm going to pitch him this thing called Brahms PD that's actually a stealth vehicle for all these cool ideas I have. And he'll go for it because he's this maverick guy. So I did a pitch called Brahms PD that was, you're a cop, it's first person, but it had this framing device of a police psychiatrist interviewing you. And it had some of what was in Shattered Memories of the game analyzing what you're doing as you're playing the game and manipulating things. We pitch him that, and he's like, "Oh no, this is completely wrong. Brahms PD is just a straight up shooter. None of this complex stuff, right?" So it's like, damn. But then he's like, "Look, we really want to do something on the Wii. Pitch us something on Wii." So we took some of those elements into a Wii pitch, which I think is on the internet, which I think was called Cold Heart. That was an original story in Silent Hill, had this idea of the psychiatrist, had some of the ideas we had in there, but they were still insisting that Silent Hill and Wii should have like motion control combat, swinging pipes and shooting guns.
Yeah.
And some other strange ideas. And then there's so much just randomness in the industry at the time.
Yeah.
At some point, Konami were like, "Look, guys, we just really want you to make another PSP game. We'll call it Origins 2. To his tremendous, like, fair dues, the studio head at the time, Simon Gardner, was on a call with Konami, and they were like, "Please just make us this Origins 2." And he was like, "No." He's like, "Origins got like 78 Metacritic. People said that traditional format is like a bit tired now." Like, he's like, "There's no incentive for us to make this game. We're not making enough. We're not even making are we going to make a profit on this game? It's not, as a studio, it doesn't help us to make another of these." And they said, "Well, how about," and the Maverick guy was on the call, and he was like, "How about you make this for us, but you also get to make Sam's cool Wii idea, right? We know that that's the idea you like, and it's all cool and innovative." So they were like, "Okay, we're going to make a PSP game and a Wii game, one for them, one for us."
Yeah.
We start kind of poodling around on this, and at some point, I think maybe this was during production, somebody at Konami went, "Why are you making 2 games? It's expensive. It should just be the one game on all the platforms." Yeah. But the thing that was really cool, and I can't remember the exact time frame of it, but because there was all this back and forth nonsense and pitching and contracts and all sorts of stuff, it ended up that I basically had 6 months free to design this game on paper, which never happened before or after.
We would get told that there were games in the building, and that, like, as a designer, it'd be like, "Okay, we've got this new game," and they're making assets already. It's like you're writing the game design documents to catch the artists.
100%. So as someone that's trying to tell a story, right, and this happened like on Legacy of Kain after this, like, it's go. We now have a team of 50 people, 60 people. They're building levels. They're building monsters. They're doing combat design. And I'm there like, we haven't written the story yet. Like, we can't integrate all this usefully. Somehow, magically, on Shattered Memories, I just had the time where we weren't signing things, and I was free, and I got to say, this is the game. This is the story we're telling. Here are the mechanics. Here's how they tie into this. Here are the levels. This is why each level matters. We had this thing of like, each puzzle should speak to the central story and the central metaphor. It just became a very dense, thoughtful design because we had the time to do it that way. So then, so it ended up being me going, and we were being very, I don't want to say brave, but like, and this was all down to the Wii. Like, the fact that we were on Wii there were 2 things, because we were constantly being told, "Sam, stop it with the innovative ideas and being experimental and stuff, like, stop it." But we had 2 things in our pocket. One was, it was Silent Hill. A number of meetings I was in where the execs would be like, "Oh, I guess you get to do this because it's Silent Hill. Silent Hill's supposed to be just awkward and sad and depressing and avant-garde, so I guess you get to do this thing." But the other thing was, it was on Wii, and Wii was blowing up. And everybody knew that people who played on Wii were not necessarily hardcore gamers. It was new gamers, lapsed gamers. So we got to say, "Look, we want to make a horror game that isn't exactly like every other horror game, because this audience doesn't know what to expect."
Yeah, they're open to novel interactions.
They watch horror movies. They're not going to expect that a psychological horror game involves me hoarding medikits and ammo.
Yeah.
And that's when we pitched like the idea of doing away with combat and the horror element being a chase. Because I was like, look, watch a slasher movie, watch a supernatural movie. The action element is someone being chased and it being terrifying, right?
Yeah.
So, those were the 2 things that gave me the ability to be like, okay, I'm not going to make exactly the same game again. Let's sit here and be like, how do I want to tell an interesting narrative? What's an idea I want to explore? Let's do some things that are pushing boundaries in some areas. So then, and we executed on it, right? And when we finished, I mean, commercially, it was a problem that at that point the market had fallen out of Wii. So
Yeah.
Konami kind of backed away from it. But you know, at the end of it, I was like, we pretty much did what we set out to do. And that was like the moment where I kind of stepped back and was like, hang on a minute, I'm like game directing these interesting experimental narrative games, telling stories in video games. Like, this is my thing. Like,
Yeah.
and this is maybe the thing I've always wanted to do, but I never articulated it as a goal, right? And
Yeah.
so then I was like, okay, I'm going to keep doing this.
And so you've got that in your head now, and we could probably spend 3 podcasts on Legacy of Kain and everything that happened there, right? But let's actually use that as a vessel, because I'm aware of time as well. So let's use that as a vessel to, you know, you're actually engaging with Legacy of Kain with now this idea articulated in your head about like, maybe this is what I want to do. And then at some point after Legacy of Kain, you make the break to indie. So how did that come about?
So yeah, I think it was, horrifically dramatic and poignant that, you know, I made Shattered Memories and went, that's it. This is what I want to do. I want to game direct single player, you know, medium to big budget narrative games. And around that time, like I think BioShock had come out.
Yeah.
And it's like,
2007.
like people really want to take games seriously. And it felt like, maybe every publisher is going to want their prestige narrative game, right? Like their BioShock, they're going to want a single player story driven game that has some ambitious themes and is pushing things, right? And I was like, that's it. This is my career path now. I want to keep doing these things. And pretty much having decided that ceased to be a thing. You know, almost overnight, they were like, well, BioShock doesn't sell enough. It needs multiplayer. And then mobile games came along. And it's like, hang on a minute, you're making $1 billion from Candy Crush? Why should we spend this money making a single player narrative game that's expensive? And the new consoles were coming along. And so, you know, during the making of Legacy of Kain, you saw the publishers panicking because games were getting more and more expensive. Yeah. And they were like, are people even going to buy the new consoles? Can we charge $70 a game? Spoiler alert, yes. Turns out you can charge $70 for a game. But just overnight almost, that as a thing, as a career path, suddenly became a very bad idea for a career path. And so really, like after the cancellation of Legacy of Kain, after 3 years of very, very hard work, I kind of looked around and I was like, these games that I thought I was going to be making right now, like Sony will let David Cage make one. Naughty Dog will make one. Yeah. Ubisoft maybe makes a couple, but actually they're becoming less of that. Right? They're becoming these more sprawling
open world things.
And so the kind of came a point, and I was like, we were seeing what was happening with the indie games scene, which was fascinating to me because, you know, going back to like that text game thing, that hobbyist indie scene at that point, maybe you sell your game as a shareware game and like 5 people buy it. It was not a viable thing.
No,
but now we were seeing that like, we had the golden age of indies and indie games were blowing up. And then mobile gaming suddenly gave you this new store, this very easy access to the market. And I had like the conflict for me was I got to this point where I realized my thing is telling character driven stories, slightly experimental narratives. That's expensive. We'd done like a year of mocap on Legacy of Kain. So I was like, I know how much it costs to do performance capture to get a character in the game. I was looking at what other indies were doing, and I was painfully aware of the compromises, right? And I knew that you could work with those compromises. So, you know, Gone Home goes, we can't afford to have characters, so we'll have a game that's set in an empty house.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
But at some point, you can only make so many empty house games and stuff. So there was a lot of tension there of me being like, can I do the things I want to do if I go indie?
That's actually a really interesting point that a lot of people don't talk about, because so many of us who are sitting in that traditional studio environment, especially the licensed product side of things, right, where you're working on other people's licenses, it really did seem at that point in time like your only options were to make a single mechanic mobile game or to like make something very, 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 very stripped back, where we were the lead designers or the game directors or, you know, creative leads of large, you know, mid-sized projects, you know, where we did have, even within these weird budgets and time constraints and random licenses. I mean, I pitched a Chuck E. Cheese game at one point in time, right? Like, but there was that scope there, and you had this incredible team of really talented people who constantly amaze you every day. As incredible and as tempting as it was watching that indie renaissance happen before your eyes, and people expressing themselves in ways that hadn't been expressed before, and wanting that, it was really, really hard to accept or swallow that bitter pill that you would be compromising on scope in almost, by almost 90%, or in this really incredible way. It was actually the moment that snapped for me where I took the leap into independent games was I saw Greg Cassavan at one point, talk about the fact that they had made Bastion with just 7 people. And it was the first time that I'd seen sort of like a mid-scope indie game doing something quite ambitious with a small team of people. And I was like, oh, we can do that. Did you have a moment like that where you thought like, oh, I have this idea, or there is some way I can do it without compromising on scope?
Yeah, and I think, and as well, there's a big thing, like you're saying, that there's like an element of inertia, but also like it's at that point as well, it was such a weird industry, and there's part of me that was like, if I go indie, like, will they let me back in? Right? Like, I've burnt my bridges. Because everyone's always like, you're as good as your last game. What did you work on? But I remember I started to think about it because I remember interviewing someone that had worked for me, had then gone away for a year, tried to do an indie thing, and it failed. I remember just being like, I got a lot of respect for this guy for having the gumption to go do this thing. So I was like, so maybe it's not, maybe it's not burning my bridges so much. But I remember probably the pivotal thing for me was playing, I think the timeline fits here, playing Simigo's Year Walk.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because what I loved about that game, apart from just its general coolness and creepiness, was it didn't feel like the $10 million or $20 million version of that game would be any better. It felt like this is the best version of Year Walk that you can make. Whereas every game idea I had in my head, and I was like, at this point, I'm like, I have some street cred with some Silent Hill fans. Like if I want to go indie and do a Kickstarter or whatever, like that was Kickstarter was the thing, right? I could pitch them, and I played a lot of like kind of hobbyist horror games. Yeah, so it's like, oh, I can go make a exploratory horror game. I can't have any characters in it, so everyone's dead and they've left notes or whatever, right? Like I can't. There are limitations. I had a design actually that was called. What was it called? Pan's Labyrinth, because that hadn't come out yet. It was Pan's the Architecture of Pan. I think it was called the Architecture of Pan. And it was the idea was that this game is taking place inside like an architectural visualization of an apartment, but the apartment has this kind of non-Euclidean geometry, and you discover that this is actually a hiding place for a malevolent entity or something. And it was massively born of like, if I can't do good graphics, oh, well, if it's intentionally supposed to look like XYZ, then this will make sense. But every time I had those ideas or had cool ideas in that space, I was like, I just know that if someone turned around and said, well, how about I give you 15 million to do this? It would have been a better version of that game. Like I could have actually gone to town and actually put characters in and stuff. So I kept being like, but when I played Simigo's Year Walk, and I was like, 2 guys made this, and I felt like I had a complete artistic experience and response to that game, and I just loved. I mean, the ending of that game where it kind of does this crazy fourth wall stuff was beautiful. That was where I was like, what did it was an intense feeling of jealousy. Like I'm sat in Climax, not getting to make games. We're doing lots of pitching. And we're just caught in this awful middle ground of publishers being like, we want indie stuff. We want cool phone games. And then you'd be like, well, this is how much it costs for us and our team of 10, 15 people to make this small indie game. And they'd be like, whoa. That's fun. It wasn't possible in a larger studio to be that agile because just things cost more. It adds up. So I just remember being incredibly jealous. I was like, shit, they've gone and done, like they've made this thing. It's so cool. It's got a pretty decent audience, and it feels cool. So that was the point where I was like, okay, I should just do this. And actually, it felt at that point riskier to stick in my job. And I was like, again, like when I was brought up, it was very much like my parents were like, you get a job and you stay there for life, kind of. And you'll get promoted on your merits. And my dad had worked for the same company for his entire career, so I had stuck at Climax. And Climax was one of those, probably very similar to what you're describing, one of those incredible incubator studios where it'd hire a lot of very junior people, give them incredible training because you'd ship like multiple games a year.
Yeah.
Under
Absolutely.
incredible time pressures, but with an expectation of a certain level of polish or execution.
Yeah.
You'd be, so you were rapidly making stuff. So, I would see people leave Climax and go off and, end up
do
with
amazing things.
right?
Exactly.
And getting paid amazing Canadian wages. But I had like a sense of loyalty, but I also bought into, at that point, this mission of like, we want to make a Silent Hill Shattered Memories. We want to make a Legacy of Kain. We want to like make a really good game in the studio. There's no reason we could. So, it's overcoming a lot of that kind of inertia. But I think at that point, I just looked around. I was like, it is genuinely riskier for me to not do this. And I had like a teeny amount of money. We didn't have enough money for me to do it. And then my father-in-law had died. And there was a workplace malpractice thing to do with asbestos, which meant that their family got this pretty modest payout. But a mother-in-law gave us some of that. And it was just enough that I like kind of looked at the numbers and I was like, if I eat the cliche, if I eat noodles and if I take over all the childcare, my wife is working, we'll burn through all this money in a year. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to go and make an indie game in a year. And, that'll be it, right? And worst case, it goes horribly wrong and I get another job in the industry and figure this thing out again.
Yeah.
But having made that decision immediately, then it was kind of exciting because I was like, okay, I only get one shot. It's like, I feel like this is my one shot. So I'm going to push as far as I can and do all the things I was told I couldn't do by publishers and make a very extreme game. If I do try and make like the obvious kind of exploratory horror game that requires a level of execution like that seems
you said
like
a wasted opportunity, right?
Yeah. Whereas, and as well, like I think I had a sense that in that world where we were past the golden age of indie, but it was still a pretty good chance to get people's attention. Yeah. Like if I make something, the more special and unique I make a thing, the easier it's going to be to get attention for it. Yeah. So that was kind of my brief to myself.
And so you broke away, and how long did it take you to sort of cobble together the bones of what was her story in regards to the concept?
This is definitely where my brain probably is confused about time frames. But the big thing I wanted to do, and I remember this is what probably some of the happiest I've been at a job was it was spring, the weather just turned nice. And the big thing I did was I knew those 6 months on Shattered Memories had been so useful. And I knew that was not having them on Legacy of Kain was incredibly painful. So I said, I'm going to give myself permission to not, I don't know if I ended up being quite as pure as this, but like to not be in a game engine. Yeah. To not just plan it out. Yeah. For 6 months. 6 months will be spent fully exploring ideas and thinking things through. Because as well, like a lot of the arguments you have in game development are that you can't fully plan a game on paper, right? You can't write a screenplay for a game. So much of it is trial and error and experimentation. But conversely, I had seen firsthand, like Crusty Demons is this game, that if you get a dev team and stick them in a game engine and they start doing stuff, they just inevitably find the fun. And sometimes you make fun out of things that shouldn't be fun and it works, right? Like the crashing in Crusty Demons was 100% that. But also a lot of the time you lie to yourself. You're like, well, this is fun because I've been sat playing this test grey box for 100 hours. It's starting to be fun just because I'm slowly losing my mind. And I saw a lot of times like you would the kind of stuff you get for free in a video game, like it's especially like in the world of horror and stuff, like it's just inherently fun to move a character around a 3D space in the dark with a flashlight. It's inherently atmospheric and spooky. Just exploring a space is in itself fun. And I was aware that, and I've been thinking this through across Shattered Memories and across Legacy of Kain, like a lot of those things that just inherently fun in a video game that, to my mind, had slightly become props that we relied on over too much. You could just put filler gameplay in amongst your cutscenes, and suddenly you have a cool story game. But is that filler stuff actually contributing to the story? Is that selling things? So that was kind of my mission, was to throw out a lot of those assumptions. And I felt like I thought people sometimes were cowardly in saying you can't say if an idea works on paper, because sometimes to make an idea work on paper is really hard. And it's easier to just be like, oh, well, we have to prototype. We have to test. Like, you can just punt it further down the road.
Yep.
So I really wanted to prove to myself that I could interrogate an idea. And this was important to me as well, because I knew that I had to have a really cool idea for it to work as this, to stand out as an indie game. Mm-hmm. So I was like, I have to, on paper, know this is a cool idea.
It's got to be confirmed.
And I wanted, as knowing it was a narrative game, to have the luxury of thinking about the stories, doing my research, thinking it through. And so I knew, the day I handed in my notice, I knew I wanted to make a police detective game. That was the thing where I was like, okay, no one's there's Phoenix Wright, there's LA Noire, there's not as many of these things as there should be. Mm-hmm. No one's necessarily nailed it in the right way. This is a huge untapped market. And I had pitched a bunch of publishers police type mystery things over the years. They'd always been like, yes, Sam, we get that this is an evergreen genre in every other medium, but it just doesn't work. So I had something to prove there. So I was like, I'm going to make a police game, detective game, mystery game. And very quickly, I was thinking about the police interview, the police interrogation. Mm-hmm. Partly because the media I was obsessed with in this genre, things like Homicide: Life on the Street, there's a British show Cracker, even the soap TV stuff The Bill, which is the British version of Law and Order, right? Yeah. Half those episodes would be people being interrogated, and that was always the good stuff. Yeah. You get the character actor of the week doing stuff. So I was like, okay, it's gonna be about the police interview. And immediately I was like, this is a good idea because it eliminates scope. I won't have the car chases and all the stuff that exists in LA Noire. I won't have to build all that stuff out. But conversely, this is cool because it's focusing in on the human element, on conversation, on dialogue. These are the things that even the big AAA games do not currently have a monopoly on, have not nailed. So that was all I had. And I allowed myself to then, like I say, this was some of the happiest professional work I've done. I would sit out in my garden in the summer and I had all of the training manuals for homicide detectives, read those cover to cover, ordered a bunch of academic texts. There was this incredible one called Laughter in the Tape that was about the role of laughter in police interviews that introduced me to really interesting terminology and apparatus that blew my mind. Just really immersed myself in this.
Did you know at this point, Sam, that you wanted to do it FMV? Or were you still... okay.
Yeah, that was, and that was in the back of my mind. Is this anime like Phoenix Wright? Is this, how does this look? And part of the research was discovering this huge burgeoning repository of real life recordings of real life police interviews, transcripts. We were on the cusp of the true crime thing happening. And really, so I was watching a lot of those. I remember I had a week where to justify that I wasn't bringing money into the family, I repainted 3 rooms. And whilst repainting these 3 rooms, I watched every single video from the Jodi Arias interview. There's hours of these interviews of Jodi Arias, which is a big case over here online. Immerse myself in that world. And I think so I started to then tap into the fact that video was becoming a big deal. Phones were just getting to the point where you could stream shows. Vine was kicking off. Video, the ubiquity of video, and then beyond that, the idea that a real life phone recording feels more real than the most cinematic movie, right? This idea of the texture of reality through video. That was something I was starting to plug into. and I'd been like reading all these transcripts, reading about the techniques that detectives use to interrogate people, how that works, how the idea of asking open questions, repeating questions, picking up on inconsistencies and details. And, all of these things I'm absorbing and thinking about. And pretty much one day I woke up and went for a walk and just like, that was it. The game was in my head. It was like all of those things mushed together.
Just like,
was like,
yeah, just materialized.
why don't I just actually film an actress doing this? It's an aesthetic that's cheap and affordable, and suddenly I'll have better facial capture than all the AAA games I was working on.
Yeah.
This idea of the database searching plugs into my text adventure background, because like the magic of the text adventure prompt, which was never fully realized in text games, always had limitations. I'm like, this has the magic of the blinking prompt, type anything, but it has the restriction of a Google search. So it's a game mechanic. It works. It has these restrictions. All those things kind of, I was just like, yeah, this all makes sense. I'm excited. I would want to play this game. This feels exciting to me as a game. And that was then, that became the idea of using video came out of that. I remember as well, like I was watching a lot of, like, what are the classic police interview scenes in movies, right? I was watching a lot of those.
Yeah.
One of those happens to be Basic Instinct, right?
Yeah.
And on the Basic Instinct DVD it had on it in the kind of behind the scenes stuff, the original casting tape that Sharon Stone did.
Wow.
And Paul Verhoeven wanted Sharon Stone to be the lead. The execs didn't. So he filmed this, but it's in like a plain room. Sharon Stone she's probably made up, but not like movie made up. It's a static shot, camera on a tripod. Paul Verhoeven is off camera in pidgin English playing the role of the detective. So the camera's just uninterrupted with Sharon Stone for that like infamous interrogation.
Yeah.
And I'm watching it and I'm like, this doesn't have any of the production values or any of the movie magic, but this is so much more real.
Yeah.
And like,
it's just raw.
Whoa, like this just hits you, like you just get this heat off Sharon Stone. So that combined with, all of these things just kind of came together and boom, and so, maybe I'd been thinking little bits and pieces, but really it was one of those magical moments where your subconscious has been working away for 6 months and then it's just like, here you go, boss.
Materializes.
And,
so let's put a pin in that right there, because I think that's you've done obviously her story became what it is, right? It became this incredible success, culturally, critically, commercially, put Sam Barlow, the name, like on the map, so to speak. And that's actually where we met. We met on the, on the sort of awards circuit that year,
That was a good year. That was a good end to my year. That was fun.
I bet. But now I want to, because there were things after her story, right? So obviously you did Telling Lies. You then obviously, was it War Games? Is that what called?
Yes. Yeah, that was like a weird little thing.
And then we have, and then of course we have Immortality. Now, and we can revisit those, I think, but it'd be great to revisit them through the lens of Immortality, because this is your most recent work, obviously, and it's a movie trilogy in a sense, right? We have the three movies. We have Ambrosio, Minsky, and two of everything. Two of everything.
Too much of everything.
Yeah. So we bring me back to the start of Immortality, like because it really feels like a culmination of all of these works come together. It's, it's not like a stop along the way or something. And and even you can look at the interaction mechanics, and I'd love to dig into this at some point in regards to them, there's always this interesting hook or mechanic. And when I say hook, I mean, because it's the thing that you're hooking through these interactive pieces of media in your game. So whether it be the blinking prompt and typing phrases, or whether it be clicking on words and subtitles, or whether it be the match cut mechanic. So what was the seed of Immortality, and where did that start for you?
I think I tell people that it was like slightly perverse. And it kind of was, maybe, in that. So in making her story, doing this little thing with War Games, making Telling Lies, like I was becoming more and more conscious, specifically like paying attention to what am I making here? And it was this, what I loved was this idea of taking all the exploration gameplay of a normal video game and applying it directly to the story or the story content. So in her story, in Telling Lies, it's slightly glib, but it's pretty true in that, like, you're exploring this massive video in the way that you would explore a planet in Metroid, right? In the way that you would backtrack in Metroid and build a mental map of the level layout. Here, you're building together a mental map of the story. You know, if you discover someone's name or whatever, that is almost like a key or a power up in Metroid that would allow you to gain more access. So I was really digging this thing I had come across through her story, but was then refining kind of this idea of taking everything I loved about exploration, discovery, kind of challenge in video games, and having it apply directly to the story. It felt like this fantastic cheat in some ways, because, you know, in a normal game, the gameplay sometimes is a distraction and occupies your brain and stops you from thinking about characters and emotions and things. Whereas here, it's like, oh, well, they're one and the same. So even if you're like obsessing over the mechanical structure of it, to do that means paying attention to the characters and their stories and emotions. So I was like, that was the thing I was really interested in. I was interested in performance specifically, and different ways of capturing performance that had a different texture to a conventional movie. But the thing that was funny to me was people kept calling these games interactive movies. And as someone loves movies, I feel like they're not movies. They're, in fact, like, you know, Telling Lies, the first page of the script said on it, this is an
anti-movie. Yeah.
Like, this is the texture of this thing is not cinematic. And so I was like, well, if you want to talk about an interactive movie, let's go make an interactive movie. And so maybe that was the starting point and was slightly glib, but quickly for me, it was like, well, what would it look like to deconstruct movies in the same way that, say, her story deconstructs a detective story? And I was aware that really what I'd been doing with those games was encouraging people to become as obsessive as me and to pay as much attention to me as me to the details of the story, right? Deep reading what people are saying, the subtext. In Telling Lies, really digging into their performance. What does this particular expression on Carrie Bichet's face mean, you know, in the context of her relationship? You know, it was very much like the magic of those games for me was in by saying this is a game mechanic, you have a quest, you have a thing to figure out, was giving people an in to becoming really obsessive about these things and kind of bringing them closer in some ways to the creative moment, in that, you know, you're giving them these stories that are in pieces and they're assembling them in some ways. There are gaps that they're filling in. Like, it's closer to the creative moment than, say, sitting in a movie theater and seeing a completely finished, immaculately cut thing. So, you know, that was the excitement, was thinking about, what does that mean for movies? Like, how do I make people be as obsessive about movies as me? What does it mean to deeply analyze or deconstruct a movie? You know, immediately thinking about, you know, poring over the footage. And very quickly, the idea was, well, it can't just be the movie. Let's expand to include the making of the movies, right? Suddenly that becomes interesting. It's a whole extra layer with glimpsing behind the scenes. And so from there, like, the idea of it being about an actress being our lens into this world, these being lost movies, giving it an air of mystery, right? That's now our quest or our challenge to figure out why these were lost. But also it kind of neatly kind of cordons them off. There's like these, you know, these found artifacts that we're kind of discovering. And you know, from the early days, it was like, oh, this is going to be an interrogation of, not to sound too pretentious, but like why we tell stories, how do stories get told, in some of the creative work. And I think 100% my struggles across 3 years making, say, Legacy of Kain, working on someone else's idea to try and tell a deep and authentic story, all of the various hierarchical challenges of that, you know, a lot of that aspect of creativity, right? Not just like the fun of going off and making a her story and getting to do what I wanted, but also like, oh, in these larger productions, of which movies are very similar in that you have all these hierarchies of money and different visions for things. That, I think, became very quickly part of it. And then, you know, we did a lot of development across the pandemic. And I think at the time I was thinking we weren't consciously really incorporating the pandemic into it, but I think there was definitely an element of the struggle of just thinking about like watching your life slip away, losing a couple of years of your life, and what am I doing here? A lot of people thought about their careers and jobs, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the Great Resignation.
As a game director, you are forced to have all these kind of very selfish thoughts of like, well, how many games do I have in me? Should I be doing one for them, one for me? Should I be putting everything into the one great American video game? Or should I just be making as many games as possible, learning as much in the process, and all these things. So I think a lot of that gets smooched into it, and then just so much then kind of fell out of, again, giving myself this research. We had so much fun just digging into the history of cinema.
It's such a beautiful love letter to like those 3 eras of film as well. It's one of the things that's immediately striking about this work in comparison to your others is how well, in regards to the production design and even all the way down to like the difference in the subtitle effects or the film grain or the resolution or the aspect ratio, even the audio quality across the 3 genres. There's so much attention to detail paid there. And then even outside of that, in the little exterior, recce's that they're going on between a couple of the characters, scouting locations and things. It's quite an impressive production. It's funny us talking about scope and having your single, Verhoeven inspired camera, and now all of a sudden you're not just making one game, Sam. You're making 3 movies and the making of documentary and then a game on top of it.
Yeah.
But and then also through the pandemic, how long was development all up, and how did you go about that sort of creating these three worlds? Did you work with a production designer?
So we started, I think, literally officially kicked off the 1st of January 2020, just before the world went to hell. We literally got an office. I hired some people. We moved in. We're like, 2020 is going to be an incredible year.
This is our year, man.
So yeah, I mean, partly especially working on Telling Lies, which was a bigger crew.
Really interesting. Okay. Yep.
Worked with prior to that, I'd done bigger motion capture shoots, but obviously a motion capture shoot is inherently limited. Then Her Story was very run and gun, me and Viva in a room, very low budget. So then when we made Telling Lies, it was more of an indie movie crew. And I was aware of how artfully everybody had done their job on Telling Lies. To create something that was supposed to look like webcam footage, but slightly elevated, but not in a way that would detract from the authenticity. And I think they didn't necessarily get the recognition, right? Like costume, the color coding, the mise en scene, the little details, how we figured out our camera rig, how that was executed, how the body language communicated certain things. There was a lot that happened there, but because it was presented as, it's just found footage, clearly it was not as showy for those people. So there was definitely part of giving myself permission to attempt Immortality was knowing how well the crew had worked, knowing how skillful all those people were, and being like, okay, well, let's give them an ambitious ask.
So you worked with the same film crew for?
I would say about, it was the same director of photography, some of the same production team.
Oh, cool.
Same casting directors. We didn't get to work with the same production designer and costume. But it was, it was just knowing these people are experienced indie film people. Work wonders. So it was really giving, and one of the goals with Immortality was to be stupidly ambitious. Because something, and in thinking about the history of film and 20th century cinema, thinking about when I fell in love with film, a lot of my favorite filmmakers growing up as a teenager, it was all the, apparently they're known collectively as the Brit pervs, which is the thing I didn't realize. But Ken Russell, Nick Rowe, Derek Jarman, these were all filmmakers who famously were all excessive. And there's this fine line between being self-indulgent and just going for it, right? And so even if you watch a bad Ken Russell film, it's gonna there's gonna be a lot in there. He's gonna be pushing things. Same for all those directors. So part of this game was me thinking, in some ways, Telling Lies was quite a measured work, and not in no ways was it safe, but it was. And with this one, it was like, I'm not going to make a Ken Russell movie. I'm going to make my own thing, but like I want to give myself permission to be as indulgent or as ambitious. So from the get-go, it's like, going to be ambitious here. Like you say, we're shooting essentially 3 movies, bits and pieces. We're trying to tell a story that is big and generous. And this was partly as well like coming out of my appreciation of the games I was making. I kept making the comparison to things like Zelda Breath of the Wild and Nintendo games, where just the generosity of those games, the way they respect player expression and give them freedom. I felt like they're quite unique to those games. A lot of games do not do that in the same way. But I knew that like the balance in my games was on one hand being very opaque. Like Her Story deliberately was like, we're going to start the game with a boring ass looking computer interface.
Yeah.
It's a database program. Like it's so boring, so opaque that to some extent it's a challenge to people. And you are forced to have to do more work than you might in another video game. So that's on one hand, like it's exciting for players, but it's also an ask. And for me, the way it works is I'm generous, right? So you're not going to get a game over screen. There's not going to be harsh gating. It's not like, the Dark Souls games similarly ask a lot of their players, but they're also punishing, right?
Yes,
and for me, the balance with my games is we're going to be as opaque as Dark Souls. And there's a similar amount of legwork possibly, but we're going to be generous. Like you can sit and play, I think, any of these games, my indie games, and just by you will always make progress in some way.
Yeah, just like by fumbling around, even in the dark.
Discover stuff and just enjoy the texture of things. Yeah. So going into Immortality, it was very much like let's embrace that. And I think like I'm clearly a terrible business person because. I mean, it's a given, right, that you'll never make more money than you do on your first hit, or at least make more profit, right? So like Her Story being made for tuppence.
Nothing, yeah.
Like what's the Paranormal Activity, the movie, right? Like that movie made like 100,000%.
Yeah,
right. It's ridiculous. So you're never gonna be as profitable as that. And like there were people, and I guess I could have made Her Story 2, 3, and 4. People asked for it, right? Like just do a different mystery, put a different person in the seat. Could have made a ton of money, probably. I don't know. But I'm always compelled to push as far as I possibly can. So, with Telling Lies, it was like, what's the most we can do here? Let's set out to do this ambitious thing that's 4 characters across 2 years. And again, so with Immortality, it was given how much money we have in the bank, like what if we spent every penny? It's just terrible business. But like, what if we spend every penny making the most ambitious thing we can? Which is and again, it's funny because it's not Avatar, right? It's not a Marvel movie. Like we were still a low budget production, trying every day hustling to make things work. But within my means, it's the most ambitious thing I could make.
Well, let's talk about this for a second in regards to the structure of how, because for so many of our listeners here on Game Maker's Notebook, how to even go about this process is going to be completely alien to them. And if you look at the credits for the film, the vast majority of folks are a film crew, right? And so what was the process for making Immortality? Let's look at Immortality through this lens. It's like, did you get your same 6 months of planning? Do you write your script out like, some big interactive epic, like say, David Gage with his hundreds of pages of script or something? Or do you actually just start shooting straight away and then when does the coding begin? When are you plopping things together? Are you prototyping something up before you go and run the whole thing? How do you go about making Immortality?
So my thing is probably more than people might realize if they just from the sidelines seeing the kinds of things we're making from distance. Like I am like hardcore game design, game mechanic man. And like I say, all of my close inspirations are like Nintendo, right? In terms of game feel and execution. So knowing with these games in particular that if you go and the budget of them is weird, right? Because so much of the budget goes into the live action shoot.
Of course.
Like I'll see other indie studios and they'll be like, oh, we've just opened up a studio with 30 people headcount. And I'll be like, how are they affording this? Like, how is that possible? And then I have to remind myself, because they're not going off and shooting 3 movies with like 100 actors, right? Like, they just, all they have to do is pay their headcount. So knowing that like that, and again, on the budgets we're on, we don't get to do reshoots. We don't get to shoot the whole thing, play test it, and then reshoot it again. So we know that the last thing that happens usually is the shoot.
Right.
And to get to the shoot, we therefore need to know the game is going to work. So, and this started with like Her Story, because I was being very efficient and practical. I had no one play tested Her Story, but I had
play tested Her Story.
I had enough mechanical play testers. So like, this is how I make it work, because these things are so sprawling and nonlinear. And
yeah, of course. Yeah.
With Her Story, the balance of the script, like, because on that game, the words essentially drove a lot of the game.
Of course. The
balance of that was something that was iterated and interrogated. Like, I had a whole set of spreadsheets that would analyze the script and could see how certain clips would link to other clips, what words you'd need to type to find certain clips. And I had these spreadsheets that would like spit out, these are the 5 worst offenders right now. Like, this scene is really hard to find because the only unique word in it is orangutan, right? And all the other words have been used up. And so then I would look at this and I would go back into the script and I would just like, I'd tweak scenes,
move some words around. Bring it to the surface more.
I just kept iterating that until it had a good balance, right? So even though I was the only person that played Her Story before it released, I was pretty sure it was going to work.
That it was going to work,
Because it look at that. And I would as well, and I've done this in all the games as well, like I will have a really useful prototype, but usually I'm like the only person that can play it. So it's easier to play with. Like, so Her Story was a pure text prototype. The whole game interface was there. But when you played a video, I think it would just actually just print up the script.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was just thinking you could do it with just the text, right? Yeah.
So I'm playing it, but I knew that the subtext in the performance is important to this thing.
Yeah,
the pacing of it is down to how long the scene actually runs for.
Yeah.
So I knew that I couldn't give this prototype to somebody else and have them meaningfully play it.
Yeah.
So I think I'm very good at putting myself, like, playing and pretending to be the player.
Yeah.
So I would play. So I would have I had the mathematical backup of this is well balanced. These words all beautifully connect. And like there's a nice rising difficulty. So the later scenes in Her Story, which have more goodies in them, are, proportionally, it's slightly exponential. Like, it gets harder to find. And then I would play the game myself, pretending to be a player, to get a sense of like, well, outside of the math, like, is this just a fun experience?
Yeah.
So on Telling Lies, we actually shot everything with a bunch of actors in New York that I knew, so that we actually had, because it was mostly talking heads. It was like, it's missing the mise en scene and the costumes and the lighting.
Yeah, it's just sort of table reads sort of stuff.
And we did take that to test. We did have focus tests on that dummy version. And actually everyone got very excited because it was obviously far, far away from the finished product. But when we brought people in to test it, they really enjoyed themselves. Yeah. So I remember at the time, like, Anna were like, oh, wait. Wow, if they're enjoying this and it's not even like we haven't done all the proper stuff, then this is going to be fun. But there was lots of balancing and tweaking off of that stuff.
But now you've got Immortality, where it's not based on text, right? It's not the script.
Correct.
It's the match cuts. So were you storyboards or?
No, so we've thought about that. And then it was like, that's actually going to be twice the work, because the rotoscoping and tagging and capturing of all the frames, like, is a really hard, expensive part of it. Let's not do that. Let's grab storyboards. So the prototype on. So I mean, to rewind slightly, like, a lot of the method as well is knowing that upfront I need to create a story that has a ton of layers to it. Yeah. So there's a lot, all that 6 months of like research. We did a year on this one of just making sure the character, the story, the background, there's so much there that it will inherently
that you can dig into it. Yeah.
Dig into. And then I have like a method for outlining where we have these ridiculous, huge spreadsheets with a million dimensions. And on one level, it becomes very simple for me in that I kind of identify these are the themes of the work. So like a really clean example was like Telling Lies. We had 3 themes, control, trust, and intimacy, which spoke to the larger question of like, what happens when the government pretends to be your family, and what does that do to... there was some question that was like, this is kind of what we're exploring in Telling Lies. And it was broken down. And then so like Carrie's character was all about control. She was in a relationship with her husband who was controlling. Her mother was controlling. She, as a parent, had some insight to this. Like her story begins when her husband moves away to go undercover, and this physical separation allows her to start playing with and regaining some control in her own life. Trust was we have this character of Alex Shipp plays, who's had some really bad experiences, so is struggling to trust and become open and intimate with someone else. And along comes Logan's character. So that was like the core of her story, learning to trust Logan, and then ultimately that trust being betrayed. And then Angela's character of the cam girl was all about intimacy, and what does intimacy look like over a computer in the modern day and stuff. Those were like their core themes. But each character also intersected these other themes. And then you would have plot stuff. So you'd have like, what is the core question that's happening for Carrie's character in this first 6 months of the story? And the core question is, when David moves away, does she regain some control over her life? And the answer to that question in the story is she begins to, but then her mother shows up and she loses control in a whole different way. So you have all these kind of little narrative questions with surprising answers. And then you have kind of like interesting details or textures. So with Telling Lies, it was all about the aesthetics of surveillance. And what does it mean to surveil someone, just watch someone's domestic life for hours on end, to be in their world, whatever, that kind of intimacy. So then you have like a checklist of like, what are interesting things about surveillance? What are interesting domestic textures that you don't normally see in a conventional movie? What are things that I've observed or interesting about what it is to have an intimate conversation over a webcam and stuff? So all these just little things about like, well, eye contact becomes fucked up. How you use eye contact. So then when we basically lay out every scene in the game, and the requirement is every scene has to have every one of these things in it. So so scene 35 has to in some way explore the idea of control, whether that's, more surface level, like this character pushes back against this other character and they exert their control. All the other themes should be in there in some way or other. There has to be one detail that is about this surveillance texture, one unique, interesting angle on what it is to surveil someone has to be in this scene. Oh, well, this scene has Carrie in it, so her character's question across here is this. This scene has to meaningfully move forward that plot or answer that plot line. Right? So you basically end up, I guess it's very on a level, it's very basic because it's. I just have to look at each scene and make sure
and just hit the checkbox.
But then when someone plays it, maybe someone's really digging into Carrie's story and they watch this scene and this scene. So when they put these two scenes together, they get to see, oh, in this scene, Carrie has a loss of control. Oh, in this scene, she's regaining control. And suddenly that becomes a narrative, right? Or they're really digging into this theme of trust across it. And so they'll see a scene with his daughter in which we're exploring the idea of trust with his daughter. And then they see a scene with Alex in which we see a complete inversion of that. And that creates an interesting dramatic moment. So by having all of these layers stacked into each jigsaw piece, it's such that worst case, you just randomly throw them together. You might get some sparks.
We were just talking about your process for her story and then your process with Telling Lies and how that evolved. But how did those two processes then inform Immortality and the process of actually constructing that and the order of things?
So I think on one hand, like the kind of story, I'm going to call it the story process, which is almost maybe the level design process as well, it has a similar ethos, right? Of like, oh, we're going to spend a year doing our research, like we had fun, like interviewing and talking to people who had worked on movies at the time, worked with certain directors and stuff, putting those together, in terms of the movies themselves, I think with all these games, like when the player comes to them, there's this sense of them being found objects.
Yes.
And in the process, we also try and make them feel like found objects to us. So it was like trying to create these artifacts of movies that felt like full realized movies. And then I guess the big thing with Immortality, which was the big ask technically as well, was this idea of a game mechanic where you could pause the footage at any point, click on an item, and then be kind of match cut to another piece of footage where that appeared. And this was, I think you talked about hooks earlier.
Yeah.
I think I used the slightly more pejorative term gimmick, in that I'm always, for me, the process.
I had to shift it. I don't have the right to call them that, but you can, of course.
It'll start with the gimmick, and then very quickly the story coalesces around the gimmick, and then it becomes very
interesting,
integrated. But and some of this is like, I think, me being quite, I said earlier, I was a terrible business person, but on some level I think it's being a good business person, because I'm like, well, if there is a gimmick that gets me excited, that gets me out of bed, then when we've finished and we've done all the clever stuff, at least there will still be then this like easy thing to explain to people or show people, right? So
yeah.
Obviously, all of these games depend on the execution, on the story being interesting, on the character performances, all these things. But I know that when I'm pitching someone a game or doing a trailer or whatever, you have like 5 seconds to be like,
of course,
this is how the game works, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a practicality behind like waiting for the gimmick, but also like I just get excited if there's a new structure or a new mechanic or something where I'm like, I don't think I've quite seen that. I've never played anything like that. And with this mechanic here, like I'm always like, the word magic I use too much. I'm always like, oh, this should feel magical. Like for me, the best games have something that feels magical in them.
Yeah.
And I think a lot, and I talked a lot about with the previous games, especially on Telling Lies, about the idea of teleportation. Like, if you're in a certain scene, because Telling Lies, like, something from year one and you click and you jump through to year 2 or 3, you've managed to teleport.
Yeah.
And that's exciting, right? And if you're in a normal video game, usually in a conventional video game, you're allowed to run faster, jump higher. Like you're allowed to kind of navigate and move and do things in a way that goes beyond everyday existence.
Yeah.
So to me, this idea of teleportation is very exciting. And when we are thinking about movies, like the defining thing with movies is the cut, right? Is the montage or the cut, being able to show a character's face cut to what they were looking at. We insert the relationship. It doesn't exist anywhere on screen. It's the cut that inserts that into our
the Kuleshov effect, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can jump through time and space. So we knew that like the cut is this really magical thing about movies, and we wanted to incorporate that in the game. But if we'd made like Final Cut Simulator, where you had to actually kind of manually arrange things, then it would stop being magical. So we had this idea of like, well, by telling people you can stop at any point, click on anything, we're giving them the freedom, we're making it expressive, we're giving them a degree of like aesthetic choice. Like, do I want to rewind and frame advance to get a good shot that I'm going to cut from? But on the other hand, when you click, we are also promising you that now the game will surprise you. You will have sometimes you will have the magic of the cut, because you'll be looking at this character and cut, and now they're in a completely different situation, and there'll be some interesting, some story will be created in that cut.
Yeah.
So we knew that this was a thing we wanted to do. And like once we had the idea, it's quite easy to express, right? You just write in a design document.
Yep.
At any point you can stop and you can click and it'll cut. So then the two challenging parts there are, well, how on earth does the computer know what you clicked on? And then like, how does the computer meaningfully choose where to jump to? So we had immediately start work on those prototypes. So that's, for me, there's if you have other people and I'm not like forcing myself to not go near a computer, like you can meaningfully prove out this magical mechanic, right? Without we're waiting for everything else. So we started work on that. And those early prototypes, it was interesting because we took bits from existing movies. So I think we were using clips from Black Narcissus, Clute, The Eyes of Laura Mars, and then Eyes Wide Shut, where all the different aspect ratios and everything, and figured out, we created this initial version which allowed us to tag elements and then have them be we created like some plugins in After Effects, so After Effects would do the tracking and stuff and then feed that into the game. And we just had like so much fun playing with these prototypes. And we only had like, I don't know, 10 scenes in this prototype. And immediately we kind of knew it was working because I've seen Eyes Wide Shut a few times, and I'm quite a careful watcher of things. But having played this prototype and watched Rewind slow down a couple of shots from this movie, I was immediately noticing things I'd never noticed before. I was like, well, look at this background actor doing this weird thing with the cloak. Why is he doing that?
Yeah.
What's the painting on the wall? Like suddenly,
all these things that you want to click on, right?
And I'm like, I want to click on this thing, and just I'm obsessing over it in an interesting way. So we're like, oh, it's doing the thing. There was a point where I was worried that if it wasn't Tom Cruise, it wouldn't be fun. Like I was having so much fun clicking on Tom Cruise's face and being jumped to another Tom Cruise. And I'm like, maybe if you take Tom Cruise out of the equation, this stops working. But we had like that mechanical prototype. And then the version, like I talked about earlier, of like the prototype that only I can play was we created these cool importers that would take, so we were writing, had the huge outline that was like, these are all the different themes and subplots and things going on. And obviously in this case, you have all sorts of fun aspects, right? Of like, this is what's happening in the movie story. This is happening in the behind the scenes story. These are the dates. This is the order of the script. This is the order of real life. Here are the things going on. Like each scene should have an element of movie making craft that we're learning about, all these different things. But that then gets turned into essentially a giant screenplay that is written. It looks mostly like a giant screenplay. And we had this importer that would import that, and it would extract all the dialogue and also any character that's referenced, any object that's referenced in the action lines would get pulled out. And then
were you referencing things that weren't hero props, that were just things that were in the background as well that you knew you wanted to be there, or that was kind of half accident, half?
Yeah, it was like we're not going to write, like it wasn't a script that just describes everything in the scene, but if it was a prop that's in an actor's hand, if it was mentioned in the initial scene description, then it would be there.
Yeah, hero prop.
So this then gave us basically, when we had a draft of the script, we plugged that in and you can immediately play the entire game. And what it would do is it would drop you into a scene, and actually we had like a looping like 10-minute version of Tom Cruise. Because it was the clip we had on hand. It's just Tom Cruise kept walking over to Nicole Kidman and then going back again and walking over to Nicole Kidman, just so we had a sense of the pacing of it. And it would take the script, and so it would print the lines of dialogue up. And then every time a character was introduced or mentioned or a prop was mentioned, a rectangle would appear on the screen with that name on it. So I could play it and pretend like, oh, I'm actually watching the finished thing, right? And but it would allow me to play it. And so we had a similar amount of, and it's obviously a lot less. On one hand, it was slightly less easy to map out than, say, telling Liza her story, because the words were specific and exact there. On the other hand, we knew that we had our algorithm for deciding where to jump to gave us an ability to correct and steer in a way that those other games didn't have. Yeah. So we had the sheet, and in terms of the balancing, it could draw connections between the scenes based on the hero props and the characters that were in them and stuff. Obviously, in the finished thing, there are some connections not anticipated because there are props we put out on the day that we weren't anticipating, or there are things you saw or didn't see. That, the scripts could not predict. But so we had that navigation. But then, for the kind of the feel version of the game of like me pretending to play it, and does it actually feel good? And pacing wise, is this exciting? That's me playing the text version, and I'm seeing the dialogue come up, and then I'm seeing, in walks Eddie in Minsky, and I'm like, this is the first time I've seen Eddie. I'm going to click on it, and it drops me into a scene. And I was getting excited because I'm like, it's this scene. It's dropped me into this point of this cool scene where there's other things happening. Like, so I always, I get a sense that exciting things could happen. And we kind of set ourselves, we had like our goal, and I think we exceeded this, certainly from what I've seen of people playing it, of like, if once a play session you have a really fucking cool cut, that's the thing people remember, right? And like, this is a key piece of game design. Like when people talk about God of War 1, the first one, and they're like, oh, that game was just wall-to-wall bosses and spectacle and epicness. You make them go back and play God of War 1, it's 75% of that game is pushing boxes around and doing PS1 era puzzles, right? But it opened with this kick-ass boss fight. It had a kick-ass boss fight in the middle of the game. And like, those are the bits you remember. So we were always working to like, if we can just, you know, have this algorithm be clever,
it creates emotional highs,
that it will create like a cool cut once per gameplay. And I think it ended up being much higher than that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I had more than one.
The cool things happen. So we had that. We had that prototype. We had, you know, all this ready to go. And with this one, we didn't storyboard it. And you know, then, you know, and we had the interface pretty much working. Like the goal, this is exactly how it worked on Telling Lies. On Telling Lies, we shot everything. They delivered the finished colored footage. We dropped it into the game. The game was essentially ready, right? Like
because it's all the text mechanics and systems right?
So there wasn't that much balancing you could do once you have the final footage. There's a little bit of, you know, audio mixing and things like that. But it worked. On this one, we had a little bit more work to do because COVID slowed everyone down. So we were like, you know, it wasn't completely finished when we went to shoot. But, you know, it was a similar then process. Obviously here, just once the footage was done, it then had to be processed and tagged and rotoscoped and have all the objects tracked, which was a huge.
For yourself, did you have people playtest it once the footage came in and it was all there ready to go? Are there any moments that you can think of for yourself as the director, or, you know, for even some of the crew, where there are like missed opportunities because someone sees a prop that seemed innocuous to you, but people are projecting meaning into scenes, or that prop happens to stick out for them, but you can't click on it, or it doesn't sort of take you somewhere? Or were there any sort of like gaps, so to speak, once it all came together? Because this is the thing, right? With the match cut, it's not in the text. It's hard to test and hard to know what people's eyes are going to be drawn to.
Yeah, I mean, some of that was kind of anticipated or figured out on the day, right? Like,
okay. Yeah, oh, right, because you're looking at it, you can be like, that thing.
And to some extent, people are like, well, how'd you pull this off? And it's like, to some extent, I pull these things off because I am directing it and writing it and designing it, right? So, you know, if I handed this off to a movie director to come in and shoot, maybe there would have been bigger problems. So a lot of times we'd get to the set, we'd block out the scene, we'd talk about what the camera's going to be, what the camera's going to do. And in some cases it might be, you know, as simple as me saying to the production designer, like, there's too much clutter on here. Like, there's too many things people are going to want to click on, and, or there's too much noise, or let's make the framing a bit cleaner or something. So there's a little bit of like troubleshooting on the set. But I think, so yeah, with this one, once we had the footage in, we did a bunch of focus testing, and it was a shame it was all remote because of COVID. Because in the past, it's always been fun. I can remember
being there. They can't bang on the glass. It's not as effective if it's not in person.
I'm Telling Lies, there's like 20 people sat, and you like go, and so everyone starts on the same screen, right? And then slowly you would see everyone starting to like go in their own directions, right? And some people would initially click on the same things and kind of be in roughly the same area, but you would slowly just see people going off. And that's always kind of a fun thing, right?
Well, that's actually a hallmark of your recent games, like of these FMV sort of interactive narrative anti-movie games, is that almost from the get-go in every single game, people go off in these completely different directions. And with Immortality, it starts in quite an exceptional way, and it's quite an interesting design choice too, or direction choice, because the game almost tells you nothing about what's going on, right? Like, it's almost completely outside of the game, or even just a menu option to get any context about what you're throwing yourself into, right? So you can skip it. So interested to hear, like, you know, your thoughts there. But it immediately, like, I've watched some, playthroughs and everything online, and it's vastly different how late in the game some of the clips that I got, some folks were getting like in their first sort of run. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, the sense of progress in Immortality as well, because you get to see all your clips, and then the movie all sort of glitches out, and then you just have one, right? And so you get an idea of the amount of, let's, for want of a better word, content, or the amount of clips that you have. But there's no other real game sort of style. You're 80% through the game, or, it's hard. I know when I was playing it, I'm like, am I 5 minutes away from the end here? I know when, the Lou Reed song played, I was like, is this the end? My partner was like, is this the end? My partner's a production designer, so she was like glued to the screen the entire time on this thing. And that, how do you sort of, for yourself, and I imagine this is something you've come across in a number of games, but I felt it more so in Immortality with your others, this sense of progress. How do you balance for a player, and especially in the way that you've spoken about constructing these things, how do you ensure that the player knows that they're on the right path, or understands, like, I'm interacting with this thing and it is being generous to me, and there is no hard fail state here. You can fall out of a clip, in Immortality, and you can kind of be like, oh, I've got no leads, I've got no concrete leads, but you can just dive into something and click on something random, and soon enough it'll just, like an Elden Ring, just heading off in a direction, you pull on a thread and you're going. How do you balance that in your games, and that sense of progress, and how much do you feel your players need it as well?
Yeah, I think the early part of the game is the easy bit, because, like you say, like, you don't have to work too hard to earn stuff, and eventually things will click. And I have always valued and respected the intelligence of the player. Like, that was one of those things where I was always being told in my early days in the industry, like, don't overestimate the player. Like, people are stupid. I'm like, they're not. Yeah. They're really not. So I think there's an element to which, and there's an element to which as well, people will bend things into the shape they want. So, if someone is feeling like, if someone's getting bored's the wrong word, but like, if someone's feeling bored, they can click out, they can click on the obvious big dramatic things. They can go back to the scenes where they're like, oh, something huge was clearly happening here, and jump off from there. But if they're feeling like, oh, I'm just like having a hell of a time here, I can noodle around in the margins of this story, they could be, going down more obscure rabbit holes. And so to some extent, people kind of self-pace that initial discovery. I think the thing that is an ongoing interesting question is like the ending, right? Like you say, I mean, essentially your question of progress is like, yeah, am I done? Will I be done? How far?
Release me, Sam.
And I think, and like, her story was very explicit about that. And that then scared me because of how many people really wanted to get 100% of everything. And I was like, no, you don't need to. Like, just get the shape of it. Like, you don't 100% a sculpture. You go to an art gallery, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to leave until I've seen every inch of this thing.
Well, there's an interesting conversation there as well around, I played it on Xbox, right? And so as I'm playing, there are like achievements are popping up, and I'm like, so okay, it's a whole other thing. I knew you would have opinions on that.
Yeah. So, there's that element. And with Telling Lies, I amusingly tried to create a fake sense that there was time pressure, which was entirely artificial. Like the clock in Telling Lies ticks on. It has like a fun little algorithm that determines we're gonna pretend that to move on here, and it would always move on when you were looking at the clock. So it felt like a lot of people felt like it was actually a real time timer.
Yeah.
And I know people who told me like, oh, when I got to the end, I immediately clicked the button because I knew I was about to run out of time and I didn't want to get a game over or something. And I was like, you can never, like, it's like Xeno's.
Yeah, it's not possible.
Like, it just gets exponentially closer and closer and closer to the time running out. Because I wanted to give people a sense of like, don't feel like you need to exhaustively kind of mow every inch of this thing, right? But still, people like to do that, and definitely the big example to me, and it does it much better than we've been able to, was like in Zelda Breath of the Wild, the game I always come back to.
Yeah.
Like I always struggle with the end game in the Zelda game because it doesn't work for me. It's like
Same, yeah.
save the world, Link. And I'm like, I'm going to explore and have fun and do all the cool Zelda shit. And then at some point, you're like, I got 80% of the golden spiders. I should go trigger the end game. And kind of once you've done all the other dungeons, the sky goes dark and everyone's like, we have like moments before we'll all be doomed. Run, Link. And I'm like, I'm just going to get another golden spider, whatever, right?
Yeah.
But then at some point, I'm like, I should just trigger the end game, right? And with Breath of the Wild, that took even longer. And then you go beat Ganon, and then you continue, and it just restarts you 5 minutes before the Ganon fight in this. And so it almost immediately then kind of undoes the finality. But then with those earlier Zelda games, I would have to, so, I can't blame everyone because I was doing it, but I'd be like, I have to go get all the golden spiders. And then I'm really kind of stopping enjoying the game a little bit.
Yeah, no, of course.
And I'm not seeing the game as best light. For me, Breath of the Wild was just genius because, part of that game was to strip out a lot of, like you're saying, the gamey stuff. Like that game doesn't have a lot of the progress indicators and map markers and things a normal game would have. But the genius of Breath of the Wild was there was so much you were never going to see it all. Yeah, and they weren't telling you had to go and see it all. And Nintendo games don't have achievements, so I quite happily played Breath of the Wild for forever, beat Ganon, continued to noodle around, and then put it down, knowing, on a rainy day I can come back and play this game, and I will discover some whole ass area I've never seen before.
Yeah, I'm the same. I didn't even touch Ganon. I just noodled forever. Yeah.
But as you said, like achievements, oh my god. Because you got to have achievements. So
got to have
achievements in the game. If I put an achievement in for seeing 100% of everything, then people will try and see 100% of everything.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and it corrupts.
If I don't have that achievement, people will go and get 100% and then be really upset that they didn't get an achievement for it. So that's the lesser of two evils is I got to have the achievement in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's that was a big part of the focus testing on this one, and a lot of it was numerical. So we would have people play the game remotely, and then we would get a download of a special save file, and we could see everything they did in the game. And then I chart it all up against it, and we had goals of how long till they see something supernatural, how long till they see there are a couple of key scenes, like how long till they see these key scenes. Like, what is their pace moving through the game generally? And
are you measuring that in clips that they viewed, or are you measuring that in time, or?
Most of it comes down to clips. Yeah. So there are some people that I didn't realize this was a play style, but there are people who will like find a clip and immediately leave it, intending to come back to it.
Yeah.
So they haven't actually watched anything, but as far as the game is concerned,
they've checked the box on that clip. Yeah.
And then we took all the stats and could see like if there were areas where we needed to accelerate certain things. And then like the beauty with this one, which was really fun, which actually goes back to Shattered Memories. Shattered Memories had all of this algorithmic stuff in the background that would steer the story based on.
Yeah, I remember based on what you do, right? Even change the design of the enemies and things like that.
Yeah, there was so much stuff going on there. It was really, really fun. And so there's a similar thing here of like there is a very complicated algorithm that says when you click on, I click on an apple, I click on Marissa Marcel. It then goes, here is every place we could possibly go to. And then it has a series of rules that and weightings that it's using. Like it wants you to see new things, right?
Yeah, of course.
It has a concept of like thematically what's happening in clips.
Yeah.
If you're digging into certain areas, it might try and maintain that. It has a thing called the spooky meter. It's like, how long has it been since you saw something spooky?
Oh, cool.
Should we be steering you towards spooky things?
Yeah.
There is, I think we could have made this stronger, but there is like an element that says the longer you've been playing the game, the easier it is to be pushed towards things you haven't seen, right? So if there's if there's a few lingering things, it will try and steer you towards
interesting.
But this, and it will try and find good aesthetic matches. It will try and find cuts that will not step on dialogue and stuff. So there's all this going on. So that was definitely the bit where we were like, we can tweak this, right? Let's see how everyone's doing.
Yeah.
Is the novelty, are they seeing enough freshness? Are they graphing this, does it look like they're making meaningful routes through the story, or is it just random, right? Like, is it just scattershot? And there's an element where you do want some of that randomness. So that was a thing where we did the testing and we tweaked things.
Are you also breaking the clips up into acts or something similar, like buckets or silos of like, this is the late game stuff? So, don't show these clips until we're right at the end. Obviously, there are some that, or is it just literally the paths that you've got in regards to similar to a branching narrative or dialogue that prohibit that?
So one thing that's different about this game to the other two, so in Her Story and in Telling Lies, when you boot the game up, you could, if you type the right thing, see any single clip in the entire game.
Yeah.
But the balancing meant that, that was less likely. And even if it happened, it didn't break the game, right? It was like, Breaking Bad starts a season with, here's the horrible thing that's going to happen 6 months earlier. So, the Pulp Fiction version of Telling Lies is you see the final clip, in inverted quotes. You see what happens to David's character is the first thing. And then it's still a valid narrative structure. With Immortality, having this newfound control of like, well, we get to choose where you go to, and we get to surprise you sometimes, and we get to steer the experience more. We did add, there's some teeny bits of weighting and thresholds in there. So, for example, you are not allowed to see anything supernatural until you've seen a certain amount of content.
Yeah,
and that's weighted. Each clip has like a value for drama, I think it's called, and then it has the different themes of the story. So if there's an insert shot of somebody picking up a pencil, has probably a pretty low drama quotient.
Yeah,
because it's not moving the story forward meaningfully, but it might touch some of the thematic things. So that weights it. So like, has the player settled in a little bit, then we can start showing them supernatural stuff. Some of these supernatural things that can appear and be spawned into your game also have a weighting that pushes them a little bit further in. And then I think there are 2 scenes which also have some kind of threshold on them. And really it's not like, it's really just about sorting the opening hour out. It's just making sure that you're not inundated and confused by things, or they're dropped on you in such a way that
you're layering the themes and delivering them.
So there's a little bit of that in this game.
Because it is incredibly layered. It's like you've got the movies. First of all, you get in there and you're like, what are these movies about? Let's lay out these 3 movies. Let's figure out sort of Marissa's just journey as an actress, through these 3 films and the subject. And then you're starting to get a bit of the politics behind it. Like you say, there's the stories that are going on behind the movie. And then, of course, you have the whole supernatural element on top of it that, reveals itself as you get into it. It is quite late. It seems like something that you would need a year to sit down.
There's a page in the design document that says we're telling a story in, I think it says 4 layers, and it literally says, there's the story of the movies. That's the easiest thing for people to latch onto. Then there's the behind the scenes story, just on a very prosaic level, right? Of like so and so sleeping with so, this is their relationship. Then there's the like, what is the weirdness that's going on? What is that that bleeds into the full-on kind of supernatural stuff? And then and I think actually then the final layer was understanding my as a player relationship to this, and the extent to which it's being slightly aggressive towards me. But that was literally at the like 3 pages of the initial sketch. It was like, this is how we intend for things to kind of work and play out.
An interesting thing about it. Sorry, go.
And like the funny thing is, like it pretty much, it does work like that. But then where I have dropped into seeing people talk about the game, everybody, or at least initially, I think people have kind of dug into it more now, but like the first week or so it was out, everyone assumed the first time they saw something spooky was the same place everyone else saw the spooky thing.
Yeah.
A lot of times they were like, oh, well, that was clearly like the bit where it's being explained, where it's being dropped in. And then other people are like, no. But again, it's very simply just, and the game is looking for opportunities. And that was like the biggest balancing thing, where we were being in our minds brave in that we did some tests where we had people play it and didn't tell them anything about the game. Like you're saying, it's pretty bare bones. And people got so excited and surprised when they started to peel the layers back, and especially once they started to discover the more supernatural aspects, that we were like, and because we were like, do we, obviously a more traditional thing would be like, do we have to actually explain this as a game mechanic?
Yeah.
Do we have to give you a tutorial panel that says, if you hear a spooky noise, do this. And as well, like just talking about it in public, like when we do trailers, when we explain to people what this game is, do we talk about this aspect more explicitly? But when we saw just how, like the reactions, the gasps, the people are like, fuck, I jumped away from my screen. Like, that we're like, okay, we want to hold on to that. So that allowed us to be bravish in the balance of not excessively forcing you to discover those elements, like just letting them lie there.
I had one of those gaming moments, basically, like, that you just, that stick with you, that you remember, like, where the things are stitched together, like God of War, those salient points in your experience where, I was playing and I was a little bit tired because it was late at night, and I'm playing and my partner's already asleep. And then all of a sudden, and I was kind of, because I was in a weird state of delirium as well when it happened and my controller vibrated and kind of woke me up, and it was a moment of almost like, did that just happen? Did I dream that? And then so I rewound to see if it was me being crazy, and then it presented itself for the first spooky moment. And it was like, whoa, okay. I had no idea that the game was even supernatural at all to begin with. It was a really, really wonderful moment. I definitely appreciated the surprise there. Another surprise was, again, my partner. She's a production designer, so she's like Googling things and everything on the side as we're playing, and she's getting into it. And I noticed you have IMDb pages for the 3 movies as well within the film, which almost felt to me like it lent a huge amount of credence to this story in this kind of like fourth wall breaking way. Was that an accident, or was that on purpose? Or? It
was kind of an accident. It was annoying to me because if I would have loved to put those on there and have the correct, like, this is from 1968.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
it was more of it's one of those things of like, you could have all the plans in the world, but then like the forces of reality. So the practicality, and we did like each of the 3 movies was its own shoot. So actors were booked on Minsky, right? Or were booked on Ambrosio or whatever.
Yeah, okay.
So, a practical thing of shooting something in Hollywood is the second someone finishes shooting it, their agent uploads what they just did to IMDb. So it was mostly like a practical Hollywood thing of like people started uploading it. I was on the phone to the producer like, shit, someone just uploaded this and they used the character name that we would rather not be in the public domain before we've even released this game.
Yes, of course.
I panicked. I was like terrified because we had just put out a teaser. We were about to put out a teaser, I'm trying to remember. And the first thing every journalist did was Google Marissa Marcel to see what was going on. And that had been uploaded as Marissa Marcel on IMDb. So I was like, quick, take that down.
Yeah.
There were supernatural characters that had explicitly names that made it very clear their relationship to things. So there was like a whole scramble of me being like, I don't have IMDb Pro. somebody fix this for me.
Who has the Pro account? Let's go.
Yeah. No, I would have loved to be able to cheat. It's funny. Our lead actress Manon, she was like, "Do you need me to like disappear for a year?"
Like Marissa.
Do I need to like not have an
reality.
IMDb? Do I not, get rid of my Instagram or whatever? And I was like, I don't think so. Like, I don't think we're not going to go full Blair Witch.
Yeah.
We just want it to feel.
Actually reminds me, I told my dad back when Blair Witch came out, I told him that it was real. Like I just lent into it, and this grown man was just like, there was no blood in his face for the entire viewing of that film. It really, and I let him stew on it for at least a couple of days until he wouldn't stop talking about it. It really rattled him, and I was like, it's a movie, it's fake. It's incredible the power this stuff can have. Well, Sam, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you you know, I had such a joy diving into Immortality. It's such a yeah, it's a funny thing, right? Like to use this term, but it feels like such a towering achievement, and it feels like the culmination of. Funnily enough, you had 3 FMV games sort of before this one, and now there's like three movies within one, you know. And like I said, tackling different production styles and genres, and then moving from like, you know, using words and phrases as you hook to the match cuts and all of the elements and the layers. It really feels like just a tour de force of, you know, these two worlds meeting, which for years and years and years, folks have been trying to get film and games people to interact and do things together. And it feels like you made
meetings. I've been in some of those meetings, and
you're
it's
the
always
poster boy for
frustrating.
that, I'm sure.
It's always, they're like, well, we'll get the game designers and we'll put them in a room with the writers from the who know movies. They know about characters and writing. And I'm like, actually, the people you're talking about as game designers, they're writers in their own right. Like, and they actually understand how to write for this medium. So maybe, no, it's okay. They'll do the game. We'll do the story, and then they'll put the game design on top of it. And you're like, oh my God.
You're going to be stressing people out listening to that. Yes, it's incredibly familiar, and so I'm sure you understand like how great it is to see these worlds come together in such a wonderful way. So congratulations to yourself and your team, Sam. It's, you know, on both sides of that coin and the places in between, connecting the dots. I had such a joy playing it. And it's, again, like I said, it was one of the games that I played with my partner as well. It felt like she was playing it as much as I was. It's really something special. And really excited to see what's next. Of course, that's the troubling thing now. Like, you're right.
There's one review that said, like, I've no idea where Sam and his team go next.
And you're like, same,
well, yeah,
man.
I mean, because we were trying to be ambitious, right? And you always say like, oh, try and pretend this is the last game you make or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's the bad businessman inside me as well is like, you're gonna keep upping the stakes every time. There's only one way that can go.
Yeah, the ROI is going down.
Spend more time. Yeah, you keep spending more money and making things that are more out there. At some point it's going to break. But
maybe it sounds like a little bit of Breath of the Wild is in order. Maybe just some noodling before you face that gun, and then
a noodle. It'd be lovely. Once we just got to ship our mobile version, and then I'm going to just relax. That's definitely allowed.
Yeah, and coming out of the pandemic as well. We're all making games in the pandemic. Everyone is very tired, so looking forward to your break. Well, my friend, thank you so much. And
thanks, man.
Looking forward to our next chat. Good to catch up.
Cool.